Welcome back. This is Midnight Crime. If you enjoy falling asleep to these stories, feel free to like the video and subscribe. And before we begin, what time is it where you are, and where are you listening from tonight? Alright, let's head straight into our first story. Case 1. I need help. My wife collapsed. The caller reported his wife had collapsed minutes after taking her prescribed blood pressure medication. At the scene, paramedics noted the tablets inside the labeled bottle were uncoated and chalky, weighing nearly twice the standard dose and lacking the manufacturer's imprint. Detective Harper stood in the dim kitchen, the smell of antiseptic and faint coffee still clinging to the air. He traced the rim of the countertop absently with his fingertip, noting the faint residue of powder near the bottle's edge. It wasn't the type of mess a hurried hand would leave, too precise, too deliberate. On the stove, a kettle sat untouched, its whistle long silenced, and beside it, a small notebook lay open, pages filled with neat, looping script. Harper flipped through it slowly. Grocery lists, reminders, and then a series of numbers that made no immediate sense. He photographed the pages before setting it aside, careful not to disturb the subtle arrangement of objects around him. A single chair, slightly pulled back from the table, caught his eye, a faint scuff mark on its leg aligned perfectly with the floorboard's grain, as if nudged into place with intention. He moved to the living room, where sunlight slanted across the rug, illuminating a thin line of dust along the windowsill. Fingerprints interrupted the layer in one spot, smudged but deliberate, leading toward a small vent near the corner. Harper crouched and looked closer. The vent cover had been removed recently. Screws were set neatly on the adjacent shelf. No signs of forced entry, just careful manipulation. In the bedroom, the bed was made with meticulous precision, yet the nightstand drawer revealed a slight misalignment of papers. A prescription pad sat stacked atop a pile of letters, its top sheet imprinted with tiny indentations from writing on the pages beneath. Almost like a hidden message, accidental to the casual eye, deliberate to someone observing closely. Harper's attention shifted to the bathroom. The sink was spotless, the cabinet organized, but inside the medicine drawer, a faint discoloration on the bottom surface suggested a container had been moved repeatedly. A single tablet, different from the rest in the bottle, rested near the back, edges chipped and chalky. He pocketed it for testing, careful to note its orientation. Each room whispered the same quiet story, order disturbed in ways that suggested more than chance. Small gestures, subtle manipulations, hints of someone else's hand behind the facade of normalcy. Harper stepped back into the hallway, his eyes lingering on the door to the basement, half closed, shadows pooling beneath it. The scent of damp wood and something faintly metallic drifted upward. He didn't rush. The case, like the house itself, demanded patience. Footsteps echoed softly from the staircase above. A neighbor, perhaps, curious about the commotion. Harper paused, noting the faint but distinct rhythm, slow, controlled, deliberate. He followed it only with his awareness, cataloging each detail. The creak of a hinge, the tap of a shoe on tile, the subtle vibration in the walls that suggested movement in hidden spaces. Back in the kitchen, Harper glanced once more at the bottle. The label was crisp, official-looking, yet the contents betrayed a quiet deception. He ran a fingertip over the chalky surface, feeling its graininess, and then traced the edges of the counter, noting the faint lines of past spills cleaned so carefully they left only a suggestion, a trace meant to mislead. Outside, the afternoon sun shifted, casting long shadows into the rooms. Harper let the silence stretch, listening to the house breathe, sensing that every object, every subtle misalignment, was a clue waiting for recognition. Nothing screamed for attention, but everything mattered. Harper moved toward the basement door again, hand resting lightly on the brass knob, noting the faint warmth it retained from the afternoon sun filtering in upstairs. The scent grew stronger as he descended, a mix of damp earth, old wood, and a faint chemical tang that didn't belong to the house. His flashlight cut a narrow beam along the walls, revealing shelves lined with jars of spices and dried herbs, each labeled in tidy script, some labels slightly askew. One jar had a faint streak along its side, a smear that caught the light, a residue of some fine powder, almost imperceptible. At the far corner, a workbench held tools arranged with methodical care. Harper crouched to examine them. A set of screwdrivers, a small hammer, pliers, each aligned perfectly with the edge of the bench. A thin layer of dust covered everything, except for a narrow path leading to a stack of cardboard boxes. Each box bore a printed shipping label. Some were opened and resealed, the tape carefully trimmed and reapplied. He ran a gloved finger along one seam, feeling the subtle texture of adhesive disturbed. Near the furnace, a faint draft suggested an air vent that hadn't been noticed from above. Harper bent to inspect it. The grill had tiny scratches around the screw holes, as if it had been removed and replaced several times. A slip of paper, wedged in the corner, peeked out, a torn fragment with barely legible handwriting, numbers and letters not immediately meaningful, yet deliberate. Upstairs, the sound of the ceiling fan spun lazily, a soft mechanical hum that filled the quiet. Harper returned to the hallway, eyes drawn to a small closet. Inside, shoes were arranged by size and style, but one pair of slippers was rotated slightly inward, soles aligned in a way that didn't match the others. On a shelf above, a stack of folded laundry bore an imprint, as if something had rested atop it for weeks before being removed, an outline of a small object that left no other trace. In the study, sunlight streaked across a desk cluttered with papers, but one drawer was unlocked, revealing a single file folder. Harper pulled it open, a collection of receipts, notes, and a single photograph, faded along the edges. The photograph showed a street corner near the local pharmacy, a scene ordinary at first glance, but a small detail, a door slightly ajar, a shadow crossing the frame, made Harper pause. The angle of light in the photo didn't match the time noted on the receipt below it. From the kitchen, a soft ticking emerged, almost imperceptible. Harper traced it to the wall clock, a simple analog model. Its hands were perfectly aligned, but the pendulum moved unevenly, a subtle stutter that suggested someone had tampered with the mechanism. As evening settled, the house seemed to grow quieter, the faint noises of city life outside replaced by the subtle creaks and sighs of the building itself. Harper lingered in the living room, noting the way shadows shifted across the rug, the faint impressions in the upholstery where someone had recently rested. Each observation layered upon the last, forming a quiet, intricate map of presence and movement, deliberate and unseen. A knock at the front door startled him slightly. Harper paused, listening. It was light, measured, almost cautious. He didn't move immediately, instead taking in the faint trace of footprints in the entryway, dust, small, precise, not matching any shoes he had seen in the house. Someone had been here, recently, careful not to disturb the obvious, leaving only hints for those willing to notice. Harper left the front door unopened for the moment, stepping instead into the narrow hallway that led toward the back of the house. The air smelled faintly of wax polish and something floral, perhaps from the small vase of dried lavender on the console table. The sunlight was fading now, shifting the angle of shadows across the walls, elongating them, and making the subtle imperfections of the house's interior more pronounced. He crouched to examine the baseboards. Along one stretch, the paint was slightly scuffed, a thin line of lighter color revealing a recent touch-up that didn't quite match the surrounding tone. It was meticulous work, careful to go unnoticed unless someone looked closely. At the end of the hallway, a door led to a sunroom. The floorboards creaked softly beneath his shoes. Inside, the room was quiet, the glass walls reflecting the deepening orange of the sunset. A row of potted plants lined the sill, each arranged with care, but one pot was slightly tilted forward, leaving a faint scratch in the wooden surface beneath. Harper traced it with his finger. Nearby, a small watering can sat on a stool, its spout pointing in a precise angle toward the tilted pot, almost as if guiding it. On a wicker table, an envelope rested, partially hidden beneath a folded newspaper. Harper picked it up, noticing the handwriting was careful, deliberate. The paper inside was a receipt from a local hardware store, the timestamp from 3 days ago, but the purchase was peculiar. A single pack of gloves, 3 small glass jars, and a coil of thin wire. Nothing overtly incriminating, but the combination of items, paired with their careful concealment, hinted at a methodical purpose. He moved next to the laundry room, tucked behind a narrow doorway near the kitchen. The space was compact, with shelves of detergent and cleaning supplies. A faint streak of powder across the counter drew his eye. It didn't match anything in the visible containers. Harper ran a gloved fingertip over it, dry, fine, chalky. He bent down, noticing a tiny piece of tape at the edge of the washing machine's control panel, nearly invisible, but positioned to suggest someone had tampered with the cycle settings. A narrow staircase led upward to the attic. Harper ascended slowly, flashlight in hand, aware of every creak and groan beneath his weight. The attic was dusty, boxes stacked neatly along the walls, but one box had a lid slightly ajar. Inside, layers of old clothing concealed a small bundle wrapped in brown paper. He leaned closer. The bundle shifted slightly under the weight of his hand, revealing the edge of a small vial, capped and unlabeled. Harper made a note, careful not to disturb its placement further. Beneath the rafters, cobwebs caught the beam of his flashlight. He brushed them aside and discovered a narrow beam where the dust had been recently wiped clean, a trail leading to a small trapdoor in the far corner. It had no visible lock, but the edges were worn as if frequently opened. Harper set his flashlight down for a moment, crouched, and traced the edges with his fingertips, noting tiny scratch marks along the hinges. Someone had entered this hidden space deliberately, leaving behind only subtle signs. He returned to the main floor, feeling the shift in temperature, cooler now as the sun disappeared behind the houses across the street. The kitchen clock ticked unevenly again, a faint stutter in its rhythm that made Harper glance at the ceiling fan, whose rotation had slowed. He noticed a thin line of dust along the fan blades, disrupted in a pattern that suggested someone had recently adjusted them. Slight but consistent, a human touch interfering with the ordinary. The back porch offered a small escape from the house, and Harper stepped onto the wooden planks. The air was damp, carrying the faint scent of nearby soil and lawn. He bent to examine footprints in the dirt, noticing 2 distinct sizes, one lighter and one heavier. Both led to a small shed at the edge of the yard, its paint peeling but the lock intact. Inside, tools hung with meticulous order, and a thin layer of sawdust on the floor showed faint trails, as if someone had moved carefully to avoid leaving obvious marks. A small coil of wire matched the one from the hardware store receipt. Harper lingered in the yard, watching shadows stretch across the lawn, each tree and shrub casting intricate shapes. A bird landed on the fence post, disturbing a few fallen leaves, and the quiet movement reminded him of the house itself, full of subtle shifts, small disturbances, all deliberately orchestrated. Inside again, he paused in the living room. The faint scent of coffee lingered, stronger now as the evening cooled. He noted the alignment of the furniture, the subtle pressure marks in the rug where chairs had rested, and the tiny indentations on the cushions that suggested repeated contact. Each observation layered upon the others, forming a pattern of careful manipulation, deliberate and precise. The soft creak of the floorboards above reminded him that the house wasn't entirely empty. Harper's attention drifted upward, noticing a shadow pass behind the curtain of a second-floor window. The movement was slight, almost imperceptible, yet deliberate. He stayed still, listening. The faint shuffle of feet, the quiet click of something small being placed or adjusted. Every sound, every subtle shift, contributed to the story the house was telling. A story that remained frustratingly just out of reach, hidden in the quiet orchestration of objects, shadows, and human presence. Harper's gaze returned to the medicine bottle on the kitchen counter, now bathed in the soft glow of early twilight. The chalky residue seemed almost to absorb the fading light, a mute witness to what had happened. He touched it lightly again, feeling the texture, and let his eyes drift around the room. The alignment of the chairs, the faint scratches on the table, the way the afternoon shadows pooled in corners. Nothing was violent, nothing loud. Everything was deliberate. A soft ring echoed from the hallway telephone. Harper moved slowly toward it, noting the precise way the cord curved along the wall, untouched by casual use. The caller ID displayed a number he didn't recognize. He lifted the receiver, listening to the silence on the other end. A faint click, then the line went dead. Harper lowered the receiver, his thoughts cataloging each observation, every whisper of movement, every subtle mark, every small inconsistency that didn't fit into the routine world of the house. He walked slowly through the rooms again, retracing his steps, noting details previously overlooked. A thread pulled from the corner of a cushion, a single leaf pressed against the window pane, dust disturbed along the edge of a bookshelf. In the quiet, he felt the house exhale around him, every subtle sign a piece of the unseen puzzle. Harper didn't rush. Each room, each shadow, each faint trace was a deliberate message, and he knew the story was far from complete. Harper lingered near the hallway telephone a moment longer, letting the faint echo of the disconnected line settle into the quiet house. The dim light from the front windows cast long stripes across the floorboards, highlighting dust motes that drifted lazily through the air. He moved deliberately toward the dining room, where the table was set neatly with placemats and silverware, yet the arrangement felt almost too perfect, as if each piece had been placed with meticulous intent rather than ordinary habit. He crouched to examine the edge of the table. There were faint scratches on the surface, lines so fine they could have been overlooked as normal wear, but they traced a consistent pattern toward the center, as though something small and deliberate had been dragged across repeatedly. Harper ran a fingertip over the marks, feeling the subtle grooves, then lifted a placemat to reveal an indentation in the wood beneath, shaped like a small box or container that had been removed. The sideboard against the wall caught his attention next. Drawers were closed tightly, handles polished smooth from frequent contact. Harper pulled one open slowly and found a collection of coasters stacked neatly, but the top coaster was slightly askew. Lifting it, he discovered a thin slip of paper with a single word written faintly in pencil: "Observe." He set it aside carefully, noting its placement: intentional, unobtrusive, as though meant for someone who might notice, yet hidden from casual view. Through the sliding glass doors, the backyard stretched into early evening shadows. Harper stepped outside, the cool air brushing against his face. The garden was carefully tended, flower beds trimmed, pathways edged precisely. Yet one patch of soil bore irregular impressions, shallow and subtle. He crouched and traced them with his gloved hand. Footprints, perhaps, but they didn't match any shoes he had seen in the house. They moved toward a small tool shed, its doors slightly warped with age. Inside the shed, tools hung from pegs in near-perfect alignment, but a small table along the back wall had a faint discoloration on its surface, a ring-shaped stain, darkened over time, and beside it, a fragment of torn paper, edges uneven. Harper picked it up carefully. The fragment contained part of a printed label, something that might have once been affixed to a bottle or container. He set it in an evidence bag, noting how easily such a small object could have been overlooked. Returning to the house, Harper moved through the narrow hallway toward the guest bathroom. The air smelled faintly of cleaning agents, almost sterile. He opened the cabinet under the sink, noting a small bottle that had been rotated slightly, its label facing inward. The cap bore tiny scratches along the edges, consistent with repeated opening and closing, though nothing inside appeared disturbed. The faucet handle, polished and gleaming, had a subtle indentation at the top, too precise to be accidental. He touched it lightly, noting the faint oil from a fingertip long since wiped away. Upstairs, he explored the corridor leading to the children's rooms. One door, closed, seemed ordinary, but the doorknob bore a slight smudge, a fingerprint partially wiped away. Inside, the room was orderly, toys neatly arranged, books stacked by size, a rug pressed flat against the floor. Yet the closet had a thin layer of dust across the floor, disrupted by a small, narrow path leading to the back corner. Harper bent down and noticed tiny scuff marks, as if someone had repeatedly moved a small object along the floor. He moved to the master bedroom, where the bed was made perfectly, yet the pillows bore subtle indentations, almost like the impression of someone kneeling or leaning for a brief moment. On the nightstand, the lamp cord was looped in a precise figure eight, unusual for casual use, and a coaster bore a faint ring where a cup had been recently lifted, leaving the marks slightly darker on one side. Subtle, deliberate, an imprint of time and weight. Harper paused by the window, looking out over the quiet street. Streetlights flickered on, pooling weak yellow circles across the pavement. A mailbox across the way was slightly ajar, its flag raised despite no mail visible. He made a mental note to check later. Another small anomaly, minor yet significant when placed among the others. In the hallway, the carpet runner felt smooth beneath his feet, yet one edge was lifted ever so slightly, revealing the worn outline of the floorboards underneath. He crouched and ran a gloved hand along the seam. The pattern of wear was uneven, showing a repeated motion in one narrow strip, as though someone had walked that exact path countless times, carefully avoiding other areas. The attic staircase beckoned again, a narrow passage to a place he had only glanced at earlier. Harper ascended slowly, each step creaking softly under his weight. Dust settled on the beams above, disturbed in narrow streaks. A stack of boxes along the far wall revealed a faint trail of disturbed packing material, and the floor beneath bore tiny scratches, like the movement of small objects dragged and set back repeatedly. One box, slightly open, contained envelopes addressed in a uniform, deliberate hand, carefully folded, arranged by size. Yet one envelope was missing from the expected sequence, a subtle gap that drew Harper's attention. From the attic, he could see a portion of the roof slant through the small window. A thin line of soot marked the edge of the shingles, and beneath it, a faint smear suggested someone had climbed briefly, leaving traces carefully placed to avoid casual detection. Harper's flashlight traced the contours, illuminating tiny details, a chipped corner of a vent pipe, a small nail protruding slightly, a streak of residue along a gutter edge. Returning to the main floor, Harper paused in the foyer. The front door remained closed, but the floor bore faint impressions where someone had knelt or crouched, the pattern repeating twice before fading. Near the staircase, a thin layer of dust on the railing was disrupted in subtle, curved arcs, as though someone had traced fingers along it carefully, deliberately. He moved into the kitchen again, drawn to the medicine bottle. Its chalky contents seemed to absorb the dim light. On the counter, a faint streak of residue led to the edge of the sink. Harper followed it, noticing the subtle scrape along the countertop where the bottle must have been slid gently. He crouched and examined the cabinet below. The hinges bore tiny, consistent scratches, suggesting repeated opening, a rhythm almost invisible unless watched closely. A faint sound emerged from the hallway, a soft click, then the scrape of wood on wood. Harper froze. No one should have been here. He listened, the subtle shift of a chair, the faint brushing of fabric against the floor, then silence. He moved slowly toward the sound, flashlights sweeping across the walls. Dust disturbed along the edge of a doorway betrayed recent passage. Harper knelt, noticing tiny scuff marks leading into the guest bathroom. Inside the bathroom, the cabinet door was ajar slightly. A toothbrush lay flat on the counter, handle aligned precisely with the edge of the sink. The toothpaste tube beside it was rolled from the bottom, a neat cylinder, leaving a faint impression on the counter. Harper touched it gently. Someone had arranged this carefully, leaving the scene outwardly normal yet meticulously controlled. He stepped back, noticing for the first time the faint shadow along the ceiling, just beyond the fan. The angle of the light made it seem as if the shadow had moved subtly since he entered. Harper's breath slowed, his attention sharpening. Every mark, every scrape, every shadow hinted at human presence, controlled, deliberate, silent. He cataloged each one silently, aware that the house itself was speaking in whispers. Near the staircase, the soft ticking of the kitchen clock continued, stuttering faintly. Harper traced its rhythm against the ceiling fan's rotation and the quiet drip from a pipe in the basement. A subtle, imperfect pattern. He crouched to inspect the stair treads, noting faint scratches along the edges where someone had repeatedly stepped. Each step told a story of movement, careful avoidance, intent hidden in normalcy. Harper paused in the hallway, surveying the house. The rooms were orderly, almost pristine, yet each contained a quiet irregularity, a tilted pot, a slightly misaligned drawer, a smudge of dust or residue. Every observation layered into another, forming a network of small, deliberate actions. Outside, the street had grown darker, the wind brushing against the siding, carrying faint sounds of distant traffic, footsteps from somewhere far away. He walked back toward the kitchen, flashlight in hand, letting his eyes linger over the medicine bottle again. The chalky residue, the faint scratches on the countertop, the carefully aligned objects surrounding it. They were all deliberate, precise, controlled. Harper felt the weight of the quiet orchestration, the invisible hand shaping ordinary life into something deliberate, hidden, and watchful. A soft vibration underfoot made him glance down. The floorboards beneath the refrigerator had a faint pattern of scuff marks he hadn't noticed before, leading to the small door beneath the sink. Harper knelt, tracing the marks with gloved fingertips. They were shallow, repeated, methodical. The house itself seemed to exhale around him. Every subtle motion, every displaced object, every faint mark forming a complex, deliberate map of presence. Outside, the wind shifted again, carrying a faint metallic tang from somewhere down the street. Harper's gaze returned to the dimly lit kitchen. The bottle, the faint chalk streaks, and the subtle disarray masked disorder. He took a slow breath, cataloging each small irregularity, aware that each one was a deliberate message from someone who had moved unseen, whose actions threaded through the house in patterns meant to be observed but not understood in haste. The house was alive with these quiet signals, and Harper, moving slowly through its rooms, was cataloging them one by one, knowing, even in the absence of resolution, that each subtle trace was a piece of a larger design yet to be revealed. Harper lingered in the kitchen a long moment, letting the faint hum of the refrigerator and the soft stutter of the clock fill the silence. He felt the weight of the house settling around him, as if it had been holding its breath all day. Moving deliberately, he turned toward the narrow hallway that led to the utility room, a space he hadn't yet fully explored. The air here was cooler, faintly damp, smelling of detergent and the faint tang of metal from the water heater. Inside the utility room, shelves were stacked with cleaning supplies and spare light bulbs, but his eye was drawn to a small plastic container tucked in the corner. It bore no label, just a thin layer of dust on its lid, except for a small circular smudge the size of a fingertip. Harper set the container aside carefully, noting the way the dust had been disturbed in a near-perfect ring. He lifted the lid slowly. Inside were several pills, small and chalky, not matching any prescription in the house. He pocketed one for later testing, leaving the rest untouched. A low hum drew his attention to the water heater. He crouched, noticing faint scratches along the metal panel, subtle enough to be missed, but consistent with repeated handling. The valve had been turned recently, not the normal adjustment for routine maintenance, leaving him with the impression that someone had been here deliberately, interacting with systems that should have remained undisturbed. He moved to the garage next, the door heavy under his push. The evening light fell in long, golden streaks, illuminating dust particles that floated lazily in the space. Tools were hung on the walls with careful symmetry, yet one wrench lay on the floor, edges perfectly parallel to the floorboards, as though it had been positioned for inspection rather than use. Harper traced a gloved finger along it, noting a faint smudge of oil along the handle, recently left. Along the garage shelves, small containers of nails and screws were arranged in rows by size and color, but one box had a faint indentation, as if something had been pressed into the top and removed carefully. Harper lifted the lid gently, revealing a tiny coil of wire identical to the one he had found earlier in the shed. It was unremarkable at first glance, but the precision of its placement among the other materials felt deliberate. At the back of the garage, a door led to a narrow storage closet. Harper squeezed through. Inside, the floor was bare, but the walls bore faint lines where boxes had been shifted repeatedly, leaving subtle scratches in the paint. A small shelf had been adjusted slightly off-level, its brackets showing tiny marks of repeated manipulation. He crouched to look closer and discovered a folded note tucked behind a box. The writing was tiny, precise, almost microscopic in its detail, a list of dates and times, none immediately recognizable, yet clearly significant to someone who had been here. Returning to the main floor, Harper paused in the living room. The shadows of evening had deepened, stretching across the furniture and the patterned rug. He noted the faint impressions on the cushions again, subtle dips suggesting repeated kneeling or leaning in specific spots. On the mantel, a row of picture frames were perfectly aligned, but one frame had a hairline scratch along the edge, small enough to be dismissed by an unobservant eye, yet deliberate. He moved toward the hallway leading to the bathroom. A faint metallic scent drifted upward from the floor vent. Harper knelt to inspect. The vent cover had minute scratches along the edges, consistent with removal and replacement. Beneath, a thin layer of dust was undisturbed, except for a small, narrow path running toward the bathtub. Harper followed it carefully, noticing the faint outline of something that had been rolled along the floor, an object too small to leave a permanent mark, but large enough to disturb dust in a precise way. In the master closet, clothing hung neatly, color-coded and perfectly spaced, yet a single coat had its sleeve turned inward, as if someone had handled it and returned it in a deliberate, precise manner. Harper lifted the coat and found a small, folded slip of paper in the pocket, folded so tightly that it was nearly invisible. He opened it to find a fragment of a note, a single word, "Careful." Upstairs, the attic called again, quiet now except for the soft settling of the house. Harper ascended slowly, flashlight in hand, sweeping across stacked boxes and old furniture. A rocking chair sat in a corner, its seat cushion faintly indented, as though someone had sat there recently, then shifted without disturbing the surrounding dust. Nearby, a small trunk was latched, the lock intact but edges showing subtle wear. He leaned close, noting a faint streak of powder along one corner, chalky, similar to what he had found in the medicine bottles. A narrow crawl space along the eaves revealed faint scratches on the wooden beam, consistent with careful movement. Harper traced the marks slowly, noting their rhythm, deliberate, almost like a hidden map. Beneath one beam, A small glass vial lay partially obscured by dust, its contents a fine white powder. He handled it carefully, aware that the placement of the vial was intentional, meant to be discovered only if someone looked closely. Back on the main floor, Harper returned to the kitchen. The bottle sat in the same spot, chalky residue faintly visible under the dim light. The countertop bore subtle smears he had not yet traced fully. Near the sink, a small stack of mail had shifted slightly, revealing an edge of a letter beneath, creased and folded in a precise manner. Harper pulled it out slowly, noting the careful handwriting and the precise folds. A soft hum from the living room fan drew his attention. Harper observed the dust on the blades. A thin line was clear of debris, a small streak running the length of one blade. It suggested adjustment, perhaps repeated. He noted the time of the shadows across the floor, the stutter of the kitchen clock, the faint creaks of the floorboards, and the subtle disturbances in dust across every surface he had observed. Near the staircase, a narrow strip of carpet runner lifted slightly, revealing the floor beneath. Harper knelt, running gloved fingers along the edges. The wear patterns suggested repeated motion, a path traveled many times with deliberate care. Tiny scuffs marked each tread, subtle variations in depth indicating weight, pressure, and the rhythm of movement. In the study, papers were stacked neatly, yet Harper noticed one stack shifted slightly to the side, revealing a narrow strip of floorboard. Faint pencil marks on the floor suggested someone had measured or marked something with care. He photographed the area for reference, noting the precision of every small detail. The house seemed to pulse with these quiet anomalies, the faint disturbances forming a network of deliberate human presence. Harper moved slowly through the rooms again, retracing his steps, cataloging every subtle irregularity. Smudges, scratches, slight misalignments, faint residues. The air smelled of wax polish, faint chemicals, and the lingering presence of someone meticulous and unseen. Outside, the night had deepened. Streetlights cast long, wavering shadows across the lawn. Harper paused by the window, noting the subtle shifts in the darkness, the faint outline of branches against the sky. Inside, the house exhaled quietly, every small discovery layering upon the next, forming a web of observation that demanded patience. Returning to the kitchen, Harper's attention lingered again on the medicine bottle, its contents still chalky, unsettling in their anomaly. Around it, the room remained outwardly ordinary, yet every object bore a subtle trace of intent. Scratches, smudges, slight displacements, marks that suggested deliberate human intervention. Harper traced each one slowly with his eyes, cataloging the quiet orchestration. He moved into the dining room, noting the table again. The scratches at the center, the subtle indentation beneath the placemat, the slight tilt of the sideboard's top drawer, all combined to form a lattice of small, precise actions. Harper observed the shifting shadows from the overhead light, the faint hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen, and the quiet settling of the house itself. Each detail layered upon the last, deliberate, controlled, a careful choreography of presence and absence. A soft tap echoed from the hallway. Harper froze, listening intently. The sound repeated, faint, precise, almost casual. He moved slowly toward it, flashlights sweeping across the walls. Dust along the baseboards was slightly disturbed in a narrow, controlled path. He followed it to a small linen closet. Inside, towels and sheets were perfectly folded, yet one stack bore a faint indentation, as if something small had rested on it recently. Beneath the stack, he discovered a tiny fragment of paper, folded so minutely it could have been easily overlooked. On it was a single symbol, drawn carefully in pencil, a circle bisected by a thin line. Harper examined it closely, noting the pressure of the pencil and the precision of the line. It was deliberate, intentional, and yet it offered no immediate explanation. He replaced the fragment carefully, adjusting the towels so the indentation remained subtle. Harper stepped back, listening to the soft tick of the kitchen clock, the hum of the refrigerator, the faint creaks from the attic. The house seemed alive with these deliberate whispers, each trace of human interaction precise, measured, controlled. He lingered in the hallway, letting his gaze sweep over the rooms, cataloging each subtle anomaly. A tilted plant, a faint smudge on a countertop, a scratch along a floorboard, the precise rotation of a bottle cap, a soft indentation in the cushions. The weight of deliberate human presence hung in the quiet air, unspoken, unseen, yet unmistakable. Harper moved slowly toward the front door, pausing to look at the footprints in the entryway dust. They were faint, layered, showing variations in size and depth, as if multiple people had passed through at different times, each careful to disturb only certain areas. Beyond the door, the street was empty, quiet, shadows stretching long across the pavement under the dim glow of the streetlights. Inside, the house settled further, the soft hums and creaks merging with the rhythm of Harper's careful movements. Every observation, every faint trace, scratch, indentation, smudge, misalignment, layered into a complex map of unseen actions. He cataloged them methodically, acutely aware that each small discovery was a thread in a larger, hidden pattern, one that remained just out of reach, deliberate, controlled, and patient. The night deepened around the house. Harper paused, flashlight resting in one hand, notebook in the other, and surveyed the quiet rooms. Shadows pooled in corners, dust shifted subtly in the faint drafts, objects rested in precise alignments. The house exhaled softly, each anomaly a deliberate signal, each subtle irregularity a whisper of unseen presence. Harper moved slowly again, methodically, knowing that the story continued to unfold, hidden in every careful gesture, every subtle trace, every quiet, deliberate detail. Harper paused at the top of the narrow staircase leading to the attic again, flashlight casting a steady beam across the slanted ceiling beams. The air smelled faintly of old wood and insulation, a dry, earthy scent that mixed with the faint metallic tang he had noticed downstairs. Dust swirled lazily in the beam, settling on boxes stacked along the far wall. Most were orderly, but one was slightly ajar, edges pressed unevenly against its neighbors, revealing just a sliver of darkness inside. He crouched to inspect it. Inside, layers of old textiles concealed a small metal tin, its surface faintly scratched, corners rounded with repeated handling. Harper set it aside carefully, noting the subtle markings, tiny impressions on the lid, not accidental, but deliberate, patterns meant to be recognized only by someone who knew to look. Nearby, a small trunk had been shifted slightly, leaving faint scuff marks along the wooden floor beneath. He traced them slowly with his gloved finger. The path suggested repeated movement in one narrow arc, like someone had been organizing or inspecting the contents carefully over time. In the far corner of the attic, cobwebs hung from the rafters. Harper brushed them aside and discovered a narrow strip of floor that was unusually clean, dustless, as if wiped repeatedly or protected from accumulation. Along its edge, he noticed tiny scratch marks along the boards, too precise for ordinary use, almost like someone had walked along that exact path multiple times with care, deliberately avoiding surrounding areas. A small trapdoor led further into a hidden space beneath the eaves. Harper lifted it slowly. The space beyond was low, cramped, but organized, stacks of paper tied with twine, envelopes folded in uniform angles, some containing fragments of receipts, others blank. One envelope had been opened and resealed with a precision that suggested careful handling. He picked it up and examined it closely. The edges bore faint indentations from previous folds, the weight of the paper subtle yet deliberate. Back on the main floor, Harper moved toward the guest bedroom. The room was neat, almost sterile, yet certain details betrayed subtle interference. On the nightstand, a glass of water left on a coaster had left a faint ring on the polished surface, but the ring was offset slightly from where the glass normally rested. Harper lifted the glass carefully, noticing a slight powdery residue beneath it, chalky, similar to what he had encountered with the medicine bottles. The closet door was slightly open. Harper stepped closer, noticing that the coats and jackets hung perfectly straight, but one sleeve was tucked inwards, almost as if adjusted deliberately. He reached in and found a small, folded note pressed between two hangers. Opening it carefully, he saw a single word written in precise, small script: "Wait." He replaced it gently, aware that the placement was intentional, meant to be discovered only if one looked closely. In the hallway, the runner carpet had shifted imperceptibly. Harper knelt and traced the edges. Dust along the floorboards beneath had been disturbed in a pattern, small arcs suggesting repeated movement along the same narrow path. He rose slowly, letting his gaze sweep over the subtle changes. A picture frame slightly tilted on the wall, a faint smudge along the handrail of the staircase, a floorboard scratched along its edge. Every small detail seemed orchestrated, deliberate, controlled. He moved to the sunroom again. The plants were still lined along the windowsill, but one pot was slightly forward, and the soil bore tiny, shallow impressions, as though something had been pressed lightly into it repeatedly. Harper traced the marks with gloved fingers. A small watering can was nearby, spout angled almost too precisely toward the tilted pot, the handle showing faint where along its side. Stepping into the backyard, Harper's attention shifted to the narrow garden path. The stones were aligned meticulously, yet a single stone had been nudged slightly out of place. He knelt, noticing faint scratches along its edges and a subtle disturbance of the soil beneath, like something had been moved carefully. Footprints in the damp earth were minimal but present, small, deliberate, placed to avoid leaving obvious evidence. The tool shed at the edge of the yard had a faint metallic scent lingering in the air. Inside, tools hung neatly, but a small workbench had powdery residue along its surface, chalky like the pills. Harper traced the pattern, a narrow path leading from the back corner to a stack of boxes. One box was slightly open, revealing glass jars, carefully wrapped and positioned. He noted the precision of the arrangement, each jar resting exactly where intended. Back inside, Harper moved toward the basement. The door creaked slightly as he opened it, revealing the familiar cool, damp air. The shelves were lined with canned goods and cleaning supplies, but a narrow path along the floor had been swept clean, contrasting sharply with the surrounding dust. At the far wall, the furnace panel bore subtle scratches along its edge, as if someone had adjusted it repeatedly without leaving obvious signs. A low shelf near the water heater held a small bottle with a slightly discolored cap. Harper picked it up carefully. The contents were powdery, fine, almost imperceptible. He examined the bottom. Faint indentations suggested repeated handling, deliberate and controlled. Next to it, a coil of thin wire lay loosely, matching the one he had found in the garage and shed. Small traces linking multiple spaces, all seemingly deliberate. He moved slowly to the laundry area, where the washing machine bore faint fingerprints near the control panel. The detergent drawer had a subtle smear along its edge. Harper traced it lightly, noting the human presence in small, precise touches that left almost no obvious trace. In the living room, shadows had deepened. Harper's flashlight highlighted faint irregularities along the carpet. Small, shallow depressions suggesting objects had been shifted repeatedly in the same spots. The cushions bore tiny, precise indentations, as though someone had leaned or knelt in very specific locations. He paused at the dining table again. The scratches at the center, the indentation beneath the placemat, the slight tilt of the sideboard's top drawer, all formed a lattice of repeated, deliberate interactions. Harper ran a gloved finger along the table edge, noting the rhythm of the marks. The house seemed to breathe softly around him. Every sound, the hum of the refrigerator, the ticking clock, faint creaks from above, layering with the subtle traces of unseen presence. The hallway phone rang once, soft and deliberate. Harper lifted the receiver slowly. Silence greeted him. A faint click, then it was dead. He set it down carefully, noting the position of the cord and the small, dustless curve along the wall where it rested. Upstairs, he revisited the children's rooms. The closets remained orderly, yet the dust along the floor revealed narrow paths of repeated movement. Tiny scuff marks led toward corners, toward edges of furniture, and toward a small window that opened onto the fire escape. Harper noted the alignment of the furniture, the faint traces of repeated touch, and the subtle disruptions in dust, each small yet deliberate. He lingered in the master bedroom again. The bed was made perfectly, pillows with slight, shallow depressions. The nightstand bore the faintest smudge where a hand had rested, and the lamp cord formed a precise figure eight. On the dresser, jewelry was arranged with careful symmetry, but one ring was slightly off-center, leaving a faint indentation in the velvet tray. The house was quiet. Outside, the street was empty, shadows stretching under dim streetlights. Inside, Harper cataloged every subtle irregularity: a tilted plant, a faint residue, a tiny scratch, an indentation, a displaced object, an altered path, a trace of human presence deliberately hidden in plain sight. He moved slowly toward the kitchen once more. The medicine bottle rested where he had first noticed it. Chalky residue marked the countertop. Faint smudges traced paths away from it. The house exhaled softly around him, each subtle sign a deliberate whisper of unseen activity. Harper traced each one carefully with his eyes, cataloging every small, deliberate mark, every subtle irregularity, every faint trace, knowing that the story of this house was still unfolding, layer upon layer, in quiet, precise, and controlled movements yet to be fully understood. He paused in the hallway, flashlight resting in one hand, notebook in the other. Shadows pooled in corners, dust shifted in faint arcs, objects rested in precise alignment. Every mark, every subtle anomaly, every faint trace was a deliberate signal, a careful orchestration of unseen hands. Harper moved slowly again, methodically, aware that the house itself was speaking in whispers, revealing its secrets in the quiet, deliberate patterns of human presence, and that the story had only just begun to reveal itself. Harper lingered in the hallway a moment longer, listening to the soft hum of the house settling around him. The faint creaks of floorboards and the distant whisper of the ventilation system blended with the subtle stutter of the kitchen clock, forming a rhythm almost imperceptible but deliberate. He moved toward the breakfast nook, a small, sunlit corner at the edge of the kitchen that he had only glanced at briefly before. The tabletop was clear, polished, yet faint streaks of chalky residue traced irregular lines across the surface, as though someone had slid objects along it carefully, avoiding obvious disturbance. A single chair was pulled slightly out, its legs aligned with the grain of the floorboards in a manner too precise to be accidental. Harper knelt to inspect the floor beneath it. Faint indentations suggested repeated kneeling, as if someone had leaned there to examine something, then returned to the same position multiple times. He lifted the chair slightly and discovered a tiny fragment of paper tucked under the rear leg, a piece of what seemed to be a torn receipt or note. The edges were soft, worn, suggesting deliberate concealment over time. He traced the path back toward the living room, noticing subtle changes in dust along the floor, narrow streaks leading from one room to another, interrupted by areas untouched, almost as if someone had mapped their movement carefully, leaving a trace only a patient observer would notice. Harper followed the faint trail toward the fireplace. The mantel was lined with photos and small trinkets, each positioned with meticulous care. One small ceramic figurine was rotated slightly on its base, revealing a shallow scuff beneath, as if it had been nudged deliberately without displacing other objects. By the side of the fireplace, a built-in cabinet drew his attention. He opened the door slowly, revealing shelves of neatly folded linens and a row of small boxes. One box was slightly heavier than its neighbors and shifted faintly when pressed. Inside, Harper found a small vial, unlabeled, containing a fine white powder identical to what he had found in the medicine bottles and other hidden spaces. He set it aside carefully, noting the arrangement of objects around it. Nothing disturbed, yet everything placed in deliberate relation to one another. He moved toward the upstairs hallway. The carpet runner had shifted slightly in the middle, edges curling in tiny arcs, hinting at repeated movement along the same path. Harper knelt to inspect the impressions. They were subtle but consistent, leading toward the linen closet at the end of the hall. Inside, towels and sheets were folded precisely, but one stack bore a small indentation in the center, as if a small object had rested atop it repeatedly. Harper gently lifted the top towel and found a folded slip of paper with a single, precise marking, a circle bisected by a short line, carefully drawn. Continuing down the corridor, he paused outside the guest bedroom. The door was closed, yet a faint creak in the hinges suggested it had been opened recently. Harper pushed it slowly. The room was orderly, toys stacked, books aligned, yet a faint pattern of dust along the floor indicated narrow, repeated paths toward the window. He knelt to examine them, noticing tiny scuffs along the baseboards where the floor had been brushed or pressed subtly. A small toy car was nudged slightly forward, its tires leaving faint impressions on the rug that didn't match the usual play patterns. In the bathroom adjacent, Harper observed the cabinet under the sink. A small container had been rotated slightly, its lid showing faint scratches along the edges. On the countertop, a soap dish bore an almost imperceptible residue, chalky and granular, in a pattern that suggested repeated handling rather than casual use. The faucet handle had a small indentation along the top, consistent with subtle manipulation over time. He moved to the attic staircase once more. The narrow steps creaked underfoot, but the familiar pattern of disturbed dust along the edges guided him. At the top, the attic was quiet, boxes stacked against the walls. A few small items shifted slightly from alignment. A rocking chair bore faint impressions on its cushion, as if someone had sat briefly, shifted, and returned, leaving marks too subtle to be noticed without careful observation. Near the far wall, a small wooden crate was slightly open. Harper leaned closer, revealing a set of envelopes tied in bundles. Most were blank, but one had a small tear along the top edge and a faint pencil notation, almost invisible. Nearby, a thin layer of powder dusted the floor, forming a narrow path toward the eaves. Harper traced it slowly. Subtle scratches on the wooden beams suggested deliberate movement through the space. Careful, measured, silent. He descended again, stopping at the basement. The furnace panel bore faint scratches along its edges, consistent with repeated, careful handling. The floor beneath the water heater was swept clean in a narrow arc, contrasting sharply with surrounding dust. A small coil of wire rested on a shelf, identical to others found in the shed and garage, a thread linking multiple hidden spaces. Harper moved toward the laundry area. The washing machine bore fingerprints near the control panel, faint smudges of powder along the edges. He examined the detergent drawer, a subtle smear along the rim, repeated small presses in the same area. The floor beneath the machines showed tiny, repeated impressions, as if someone had shifted in place carefully multiple times. Back in the living room, he paused at the patterned rug. Tiny, shallow indentations suggested objects had been placed and moved repeatedly along precise lines. Cushions bore subtle depressions, the faint weight marks of human presence concentrated in specific spots. He noted the alignment of books on the shelves, the minor tilts of picture frames, the nearly imperceptible rotation of a decorative vase. Each small detail layered upon the last, forming a quiet choreography of deliberate, unseen actions. The soft ticking of the kitchen clock echoed faintly through the house. Harper traced the rhythm against the distant hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak from the attic, the subtle patterns merging into a network of deliberate, hidden movement. He returned to the hallway, inspecting the runner carpet. Faint arcs and scuffs traced repeated movement toward the master bedroom, the bathroom, and the linen closet. Inside the master bedroom, the bed remained perfectly made, pillows bearing shallow, precise depressions. The nightstand had faint smudges where hands had rested, and the lamp cord formed a careful figure eight. Jewelry on the dresser was arranged in near-perfect symmetry, but one ring rested slightly off-center, leaving a faint impression in the velvet tray. Harper paused at the window, looking out across the quiet street. Streetlights cast long shadows across the lawn, faintly illuminating the garden. The flower beds were trimmed neatly, pathways edged precisely, yet a single stone had been nudged slightly, soil disturbed in a subtle pattern. Footprints in the damp earth were faint, deliberate, placed to avoid leaving obvious evidence. Returning inside, Harper moved again through the house, cataloging every anomaly. Scratches on floorboards, faint powder residues, misaligned objects, subtle scuffs, precise rotations, soft depressions, narrow arcs of dustless floor, repeated paths traced in dust and impressions. Each small observation formed a lattice of deliberate action, a quiet, controlled orchestration of human presence that had been left behind in silence. He lingered in the kitchen once more, staring at the medicine bottle. Chalky residue marked the countertop. Nearby objects bore faint traces of manipulation. Dust on the table formed subtle lines, leading toward the sink, the fridge, and the hallway. The house exhaled around him, alive with precise, hidden gestures. Harper cataloged each detail slowly, methodically, aware that the web of unseen movements, deliberate alterations, and faint traces extended through every corner of the house. From the hallway, a faint tap echoed, a soft, deliberate sound, measured. Harper froze, listening. Dust along the baseboards revealed a narrow path leading toward the guest bedroom. He followed it carefully. Inside, the floor bore tiny scuff marks, the closet a narrow path of repeated movement, the windowsill faintly pressed from leaning or touching. A small toy had been nudged slightly forward, creating subtle impressions in the rug. In the bathroom nearby, the cabinet door was slightly ajar. A powdery residue marked the countertop. The faucet handle bore faint indentations. Harper traced each mark with care, cataloging every subtle irregularity, every deliberate disturbance. The house was alive with quiet signals. Shadows shifted gently as night deepened, dust settled in faint arcs. Objects rested in precise alignment. Every small anomaly, a tilt, a scratch, a smudge, an indentation, a displaced object, a trace of human presence, formed a deliberate, controlled narrative, waiting for recognition. Harper moved slowly, meticulously, sensing that the story of this house, threaded in subtle, deliberate movements, was still unfolding, layer by layer, whisper by whisper, and far from complete. Harper's steps were measured as he returned to the hallway, flashlights sweeping across the muted glow of the night, filtering through the windows. The house was quiet, yet alive with subtle vibrations, the hum of the refrigerator, the faint stutter of the clock, a soft draft whispering along the edges of the doors and windows. He moved toward the small study at the end of the corridor, a room he had glanced at but never fully examined. The study smelled faintly of paper and wax polish. The desk was orderly, stacks of documents aligned by size and color. Harper crouched to examine the edges. One stack bore a tiny, crescent-shaped indentation along the corner, the faint mark of repeated pressing. A thin layer of dust along the side of the desk was interrupted by a narrow, winding path leading toward the window. He traced it carefully, noting faint scuff marks along the baseboards, small enough to be dismissed but consistent in their placement. On the windowsill, a small brass figurine caught the light. It was turned slightly, its back facing outward when it should have aligned with the front of the desk. Harper lifted it gently, revealing a tiny slip of paper tucked beneath. The handwriting was meticulous, almost microscopic, a series of numbers and letters arranged in a careful sequence. He photographed it with his flashlight, careful not to disturb the arrangement. A bookshelf against the far wall bore signs of subtle interference. Most of the books were aligned perfectly, yet a single volume protruded slightly. Harper ran a finger along the edge and found faint scratches in the wood, almost imperceptible, tracing a pattern toward the corner of the room. He knelt, noting the trajectory, the rhythm of repeated movements, deliberate and precise. The chair at the desk had faint indentations in the cushion, shallow but consistent, suggesting repeated kneeling or leaning. Harper traced the edges of the seat, finding chalky residue nearly invisible to the naked eye. He rose slowly and glanced toward the floor. The rug had subtle depressions in an arc, forming a narrow path toward the door. Each mark layered onto the next, creating a quiet map of human movement, careful and intentional. He moved down the hall toward the secondary bedroom. The door was slightly ajar, a faint gap where the latch hadn't fully engaged. Inside, the room smelled faintly of dust and fabric. The bed was made neatly, yet the pillows bore shallow indentations. Harper traced the edges of the mattress and discovered faint chalky smudges along the corner, almost imperceptible. A small dresser against the wall had a drawer slightly misaligned. He opened it slowly, revealing neatly folded clothing and a narrow envelope tucked between two layers. The envelope was blank, folded precisely in thirds, its placement deliberate. Near the window, a small toy on the floor had been nudged slightly forward. Harper traced its faint tire marks in the rug, an arc repeated multiple times, indicating careful movement rather than casual play. He glanced upward. The curtain rod bore tiny scratches along the bracket edges, subtle enough to be missed, suggesting repeated handling. He ascended to the attic again. The narrow stairs creaked softly underfoot. The beam near the top bore fresh dust lines, narrow and deliberate. Boxes along the walls were mostly untouched, yet one crate had been shifted slightly forward. Harper leaned in, noticing faint scratches on the floorboards beneath it, forming a narrow curve. Inside the crate, envelopes and small bundles of paper were arranged with meticulous precision. A few were slightly out of sequence, and one had a tiny powder smudge along the edge, chalky and fine, almost imperceptible. A small section of the attic floor, previously overlooked, had been swept clean in a narrow rectangle. Harper knelt, tracing subtle scratches along the perimeter, forming a careful arc leading toward a trapdoor in the far corner. He lifted it slowly. Beneath, a crawl space revealed a low, narrow floor and walls lined with insulation. Dust had settled in thin streaks along the boards, disturbed in a pattern suggesting deliberate passage. Near the back, a small vial rested against the wall. It contained the same chalky substance he had found elsewhere. He left it in place, noting the meticulous placement. Back downstairs, Harper moved into the sunroom. The plants along the windowsill were still aligned precisely, yet the soil in one pot bore shallow impressions repeated along the surface. The watering can was angled deliberately toward that pot. Harper examined the floor. Faint streaks in the dust led toward the French doors that opened onto the backyard. He followed them slowly, noting tiny scuff marks along the threshold. The garden path was orderly, stones set in precise alignment. Yet one stone had been nudged slightly, soil disturbed around it. Footprints were minimal but deliberate, showing careful movement through the space. A small shed at the edge of the yard held tools hung neatly, Yet the workbench bore faint chalk residue. A thin coil of wire rested nearby, identical to the ones he had discovered elsewhere. Harper traced its path toward a shelf where glass jars were arranged in deliberate order. One jar was slightly shifted, faint smudges along its side indicating repeated handling. Returning inside, Harper paused in the kitchen. The countertop still bore faint chalky smudges. The bottle rested in its usual spot, residue marking the surface around it. Objects nearby, spoon, glass, coasters, showed subtle irregularities. A tilt, a faint rotation, a soft impression where a hand had rested. He cataloged each with meticulous care. The hallway carpet runner had shifted slightly again. Harper knelt, tracing a narrow path of disturbed dust that led from the master bedroom to the guest room and back. Small scuff marks along the edges suggested deliberate foot placement, repeated carefully to avoid disrupting surrounding areas. In the master bedroom, the bed was made perfectly, pillows bearing shallow depressions, the nightstand showing faint fingerprints and chalk smudges. The lamp cord formed a precise figure eight. On the dresser, jewelry was aligned almost symmetrically, but one ring rested slightly off-center, leaving a soft impression in the velvet tray. He paused by the window, peering into the quiet street. Shadows stretched long under the dim glow of streetlights. In the garden, faint impressions in the soil indicated careful movement along narrow, deliberate paths. Footprints were minimal, light, calculated. Back inside, Harper traced his steps through the house again, cataloging every anomaly. Scratches on floorboards, faint powder residue, misaligned objects, subtle scuffs, precise rotations, soft depressions, narrow arcs of dustless floor, repeated paths in dust and impressions. Each observation formed a lattice of deliberate action, quiet yet purposeful. He lingered in the kitchen once more, flashlight illuminating the chalky residue around the medicine bottle. The house exhaled around him. Shadows pooled in corners, dust shifted in faint arcs, objects rested in precise alignment. Every mark, every subtle anomaly, every trace of human presence spoke in whispers, deliberate, controlled, and carefully hidden. Harper moved slowly, methodically, aware that the narrative woven through these quiet, precise traces was still unfolding, layer upon layer, each subtle movement revealing only a fraction of the unseen story. At the base of the staircase, he paused again, tracing the faint scuff marks leading upward. The carpet runner shifted imperceptibly beneath his hand. A soft tap echoed from the hall, a sound precise, deliberate, measured. Harper froze, listening. Dust along the baseboards revealed a narrow path leading toward the linen closet. He followed it carefully, noting the subtle arc of repeated movement. Inside the closet, the towels and sheets were folded perfectly, yet one stack bore a faint indentation, suggesting something small had rested there repeatedly. Beneath the top towel, Harper discovered a folded slip of paper with a symbol, a circle bisected by a line, drawn carefully, almost imperceptible. He photographed it carefully, replacing the towels so the indentation remained subtle. The house seemed to breathe with quiet signals, faint disturbances in dust, soft scratches along wood, slight misalignments, subtle rotations, shallow depressions, traces of human presence deliberate and repeated. Harper moved slowly, cataloging each mark, aware that every small, deliberate anomaly was part of a pattern extending through the house, one that remained hidden, precise, and patient, still unfolding, still whispering its secrets, layer by layer. Harper lingered in the hallway, letting the quiet of the house settle around him. The soft hum of the refrigerator, the distant stutter of the clock, even the faint creak of the floorboards all seemed to speak in measured rhythms now, not merely as background noise, but as subtle echoes of repeated patterns he had traced over the past hours. As he moved slowly through the rooms, the accumulation of small, deliberate traces began to form a picture, not in a single revelation, but in the gentle unfolding of quiet connections. In the kitchen, he lingered by the countertop. The medicine bottle still sat where it had first caught his attention, the chalky residue faint against the polished surface. But now, seeing it alongside the small vials, the slips of paper tucked in closets, the subtle scuff marks along floorboards, he realized these were not signs of randomness or malice. Each mark, each tiny disturbance, spoke of careful observation and repeated handling by someone intimately familiar with the routines of the house. He moved to the utility room again, crouching by the container tucked in the corner. The pills, chalky and uncoated, had initially suggested tampering in the clinical sense, yet now Harper considered a quieter possibility: meticulous experimentation. The traces of repeated handling, the careful placement in hidden corners, the subtle rotation of objects, all hinted at someone testing outcomes in a controlled, deliberate manner. He traced the faint scratches along the water heater valve and the furnace panel. These were not signs of hurried interference, but of slow, methodical adjustment, patterns consistent with someone attempting to observe or influence dosage and effect without leaving obvious evidence. Harper's mind began to connect the faint powder residues across the house, the small coils of wire, the repeated paths along dusted floors. This was not an act of malice toward strangers, but an obsessive monitoring of the immediate environment, precise and cautious. In the attic, the narrow streaks of clean dust and the shifted boxes no longer felt sinister, only methodical. Harper noted the repetition in movement, the vials placed just so, the paper slips tucked carefully between linens, the faint powder traces along corners. It was a pattern of measured experimentation and observation, practiced over time, not a single act of sabotage. The house itself became readable in a new way, not a scene of hidden danger, but a carefully maintained system, a personal project unfolding quietly in plain sight. The small notes, with their symbols and cryptic numbers, made sense in this light. They were records, cataloging the subtle interactions and adjustments that had taken place over days, weeks, or months. Each marking traced a step, a reaction, a small deviation observed in a controlled environment. The circle bisected by a line, the folded slips tucked under towels and books, even the faintly rotated objects, all were documentation, quiet and private, of the repeated experiments. Harper returned to the bedroom, moving slowly over the familiar creases in the bed and the faint impressions on the pillows. The powder on the countertops, the slightly heavier boxes in the attic, the delicate misalignments of objects, all formed a pattern of someone quietly testing boundaries, tracking minute reactions, and ensuring control over the environment. The house itself no longer seemed a scene of deliberate harm, but a careful laboratory of observation. In the backyard, Harper knelt by the shifted garden stones and the narrow arcs of footprints. These were not hurried or clumsy movements, but deliberate steps, placed carefully to maintain privacy and avoid disruption. The shed, the workbench, the glass jars, the coil of wire, they were tools for recording, measuring, adjusting. Everything was intentional, controlled, and quiet. As he walked slowly through the sunroom, the soil impressions in the pots became part of a pattern of monitoring and tending, small and precise actions that were observed, recorded, and repeated. The faint smudges, scratches, and tiny indentations scattered throughout the house were no longer threats. They were a language of care, of methodical attention, and of a meticulous process. Harper paused in the study, looking at the slip of paper with numbers and letters, the slight scratches on the wood, the indentation in the corner of the rug. It all came together as a slow realization. The house had been maintained and observed with quiet precision by its occupant, someone deeply attentive, careful, and meticulous. The chalky pills were an unfortunate accident. The intended dosage had been mismanaged by habit or oversight rather than malice. He returned to the kitchen, the medicine bottle in hand. The air was still, heavy with calm. Harper placed it gently back on the countertop and stepped back, letting the scene settle around him. The house, with its subtle disturbances and careful patterns, no longer felt mysterious or threatening. It felt alive with the slow, deliberate attention of someone trying to manage a complex life with care, someone learning through repetition and observation, making mistakes but not with intent to harm. The soft hum of the refrigerator, the distant stutter of the clock, the gentle settling of floorboards, all these ordinary sounds now carried a quiet reassurance. Harper moved through the house one last time, tracing the familiar paths, noting the soft impressions, the faint powder, the subtle scuffs, the carefully rotated objects. He cataloged them quietly, understanding now that the story was not of sabotage, but of methodical human attention and an unfortunate lapse that had caused harm. The evening light faded completely, leaving only the faint glow of street lights and the gentle shadows within the rooms. Harper stood in the hallway, letting the calm of the house fill the space. Each trace, each small anomaly, now read as part of a coherent whole, a series of intentional, careful actions that had grown into a pattern, missteps included, but not violence or malice. He exhaled slowly, closing the hallway door behind him. The house settled with a soft sigh. Outside, the street was quiet. Inside, every room, every corner, every subtle detail had been observed, cataloged, and understood. Harper walked toward the front door, pausing to glance once more at the faint traces on the floor, the slight rotations of objects, the subtle chalk residue. Everything spoke of care, of attention, of human imperfection quietly documented. He stepped out into the night, letting the cool air fill the space behind him. The mystery of the house had resolved not with confrontation, but with observation and reflection, the threads of subtle action and quiet mistake woven together into understanding. The story settled, calm and complete, leaving only the gentle hum of a house, now quiet and steady, as Harper walked slowly down the empty street, carrying with him the careful, deliberate traces of what had unfolded inside. Case 2. A courier van reported in the depot had shifted 10 meters overnight. The rear doors showed scuff marks from repeated opening and closing. Tire imprints suggested a precise U-turn in the lot. Rain had left the depot asphalt glistening in dim streetlight as Mara crouched beside the van, tracing the faint scuff marks along the rear doors with gloved fingers. They were shallow, repetitive, almost imperceptible unless you slowed your gaze. The smell of wet concrete and oil hung in the air, heavy but familiar, the kind that lingered in places where machinery slept at night. She moved around the van slowly, listening to the soft hum of the refrigeration units from nearby trucks, each pulse of vibration echoing through her boots as she stepped carefully over tire tracks in the mud. The U-turn imprint was subtle but undeniable, a perfect semicircle etched into the wet ground, ending mere meters from a chain-link fence topped with barbed wire. Mara paused there, noticing something small, a single metal clip wedged under the fence post, bent slightly as if it had been forced in by hand. A faint clatter drew her attention to the far corner of the lot, where discarded pallets had been stacked haphazardly. One had shifted overnight, leaning against another in a way that created a small triangular gap. Inside, she glimpsed a pair of work gloves, dirty but folded neatly, and a notebook, edges damp but intact. She reached for the notebook, flipping it open gently. The pages were filled with handwritten numbers and letters, unremarkable at first glance, but some sequences were circled, underlined in faint pencil, patterns that didn't match any known route logs she'd seen before. Mara tucked the notebook into her jacket and continued along the edge of the lot. The night was still, the air pressing against her ears. A faint whine carried from a distant generator, steady and low, masking almost every other sound. Near the loading docks, a single door was ajar, revealing the dark interior of the warehouse beyond. The light from her flashlight caught a reflection, a strip of yellow tape across the floor, worn in the middle as though footsteps had pressed repeatedly against it. She knelt, examining it closer, and noticed tiny flecks of paint embedded in the tape, blue and silver, smeared as if someone had brushed against a pallet of freshly painted crates. She moved carefully inside, each step on the concrete echoing softly. The warehouse smelled of sawdust and damp cardboard. Stacks of boxes were organized with geometric precision, each row aligned perfectly, though the labels were inconsistent. Some crates marked with dates from the previous month, others with codes she didn't recognize. Mara's fingers brushed against a crate labeled fragile, handle with care, only to discover a faint scratch along its edge, a precise line that could only have been made by a thin metal tool. From a distance, she heard the faint hum of a forklift starting somewhere deep in the warehouse. But when she looked toward the noise, the aisles were empty. The sound dissipated as quickly as it had begun, leaving a heavy silence. Mara paused, tilting her head, noticing the way shadows pooled against the walls, how the gaps between the crates created odd geometric spaces where light seemed swallowed. One aisle, in particular, had a subtle warmth radiating from the floor, unusual in the otherwise cold concrete. She followed it, tracing the heat to a metal vent near the back wall, its surface slightly warmer than the surrounding panels. She pressed her palm against it. Barely perceptible vibrations pulsed underneath, like a heartbeat echoing through metal. Moving deeper, she reached a narrow corridor she hadn't noticed before, blocked at the end by a pallet stacked too high to see over. A faint scent of machine oil and something sweet lingered in the air. Her eyes caught a reflection off the edge of a metal latch, small but polished as if used frequently. Mara crouched, tracing the latch with her fingertip. Below it, scratched lightly into the concrete floor, were shallow grooves forming a subtle pattern, repeating every few inches. They were too deliberate to be accidental, yet their purpose remained unclear. She leaned against the pallet for a moment, listening. Somewhere beyond the high stacks, the faint drip of water echoed rhythmically, steady, deliberate, as though someone had adjusted the pipes to create a quiet metronome. Mara let her mind wander across the tiny details: scuffed doors, tire marks, vent vibrations, grooves in concrete, flecks of paint. Each discovery was small, almost inconsequential alone, yet together they formed a web of controlled movement, careful intervention. Whoever had been here moved through the space deliberately, leaving traces that demanded attention, but never so much that a casual observer would notice. Her attention shifted back to the vent. The warmth under her hand pulsed again, faint but consistent. It reminded her of the U-turn outside, the gloves in the corner, the precise scuffs on the van. She made a mental note to return with equipment to measure temperature changes more accurately, to record the subtle movements in the warehouse over time. The night grew colder. Mara's breath fogged in the air, and the rain-slicked windows of the warehouse caught the distant lights of passing trucks, casting long streaks of reflection across the concrete floor. She straightened, brushing dust from her jacket, and moved toward the back exit. Outside, the lot seemed emptier than before, quieter somehow, though the van remained, imperceptibly shifted, like a sentinel in the fog. As she walked along the perimeter, her eyes caught a shadow at the edge of the chain-link fence. For a moment it seemed to pulse, almost like a figure had crouched there and melted back into the darkness. She stopped, holding her flashlight steady, scanning slowly. Nothing moved, yet the faint impression lingered. The van, the warehouse, the scattered pallets, all touched by someone else's careful hand, someone who knew the space intimately, someone whose presence was almost ghost-like, but undeniably there. Mara exhaled slowly, listening to the drip of water, the distant hum, the soft scuffing of tires settling into mud, and realized that every subtle sign, every minor disturbance, was a conversation left behind for her to decode. She turned back toward the depot office, notebook tucked against her chest, mind quietly assembling patterns from fragments, aware that each night the story deepened, layer by layer, almost imperceptibly. And somewhere beyond the fence, the air shifted, heavy with deliberate intent, as if the unseen hands that had orchestrated the movements were waiting, watching, leaving just enough evidence to be found, and yet, never the whole truth. Mara returned to the depot office just as a low fog began to curl across the lot, softening the edges of the fluorescent lights overhead. The office smelled faintly of paper, coffee, and the lingering trace of rain. She set the notebook on the desk, flipping it open again, noticing something she had missed before. Tiny smudges along the margins, fingerprints faintly pressed into the paper. They were almost invisible, but when angled under the desk lamp, the ridges caught the light, each swirl telling the silent story of someone handling the pages in a deliberate rhythm. She moved to the window, resting her forehead against the glass. Outside, the van was still, yet somehow the scuff marks along the rear door seemed sharper under the mist. The chain-link fence glistened, droplets clinging to each barb, refracting the depot lights into thin, fragile streaks. The impression of movement lingered, subtle, like a whispered hint that the lot had been alive while she was elsewhere. The fog led her back toward the shipping bay doors. They were slightly ajar, and as she approached, she noticed a faint odor of metal and mildew. A single box had been nudged off its pallet, leaning against the wall with edges frayed and corners pressed inward. Inside, she found a thin coil of wire, carefully wound and tucked into a corner, coated lightly with dust as though left to age unnoticed. The coil seemed ordinary, yet the neatness suggested it had been placed intentionally, like a marker or signal. She crouched, brushing the dust from the floor around it, revealing a series of faint scratches that ran parallel to the wall, so fine they could have been mistaken for accidental abrasion. But their spacing was deliberate, each line equidistant, tracing a path from the door to the corner where the wire rested. Mara traced them with her fingertip, feeling the subtle grooves press lightly against her glove. She stood slowly, realizing she had spent longer than she intended studying marks most people would overlook entirely. In the corner of the shipping bay, stacked crates formed a small alcove that had gone unnoticed. One crate had a tiny chip in the wood, revealing a smooth, polished interior. Mara pressed the corner with her finger and found a folded scrap of paper hidden inside. It was blank except for a single set of initials, scrawled in faint pencil, almost illegible. She pressed the paper flat against her palm, turning it over again and again, trying to discern whether the initials were a signature or a signal, a clue or a misdirection. The sound of distant machinery shifted her attention toward the far wall. A narrow passage led into a storage corridor lined with shelves stacked unevenly with supplies. Between boxes of tape and rolls of plastic wrap, she noticed a faint indentation in the floor, like the shadow of a small handcart had rested there overnight. The depression was shallow, yet her experience told her it was too precise to be random. She followed the path of the indentation slowly, noticing how it wove through the corridor, passing under shelving and around stacks as though someone had rehearsed the route countless times. A soft, metallic click echoed somewhere to her left. She froze, holding her breath, scanning the corridor. The sound repeated once, faint, deliberate. When she approached, she saw a latch on a low cabinet, slightly ajar, its hinge greased to move silently. Inside, she found a bundle of envelopes, edges slightly damp, their contents not letters but photographs. Each photo was small, black and white, depicting angles of the depot she had walked 100 times. Doors, pallets, tire tracks, the rear of the van. Some were taken at night, others in the early hours of the morning. Mara's chest tightened. Each image was precise, capturing a level of observation that bordered on intimate. She left the cabinet, careful not to disturb anything else, and continued down the corridor. The air was cooler here, carrying a faint hint of ozone, like the residue of electrical discharge. Along the wall, a series of tiny holes were drilled in a straight line, no larger than a pinhead. At first, she assumed they were old wiring attempts, but their placement was meticulous, measured. The line led toward a set of double doors at the end of the corridor. She approached slowly, brushing her fingers across the metal surface. It was smooth, polished in a small patch where hands had frequently pressed. Through a narrow gap at the bottom of the doors, Mara noticed a faint gleam. The floor beyond was wet, reflecting a single strip of light from above. She pressed her ear to the door and caught a low hum, irregular, almost like someone was moving equipment carefully, deliberately, but without purpose that could be discerned immediately. The rhythm of the hum matched neither the machinery she had passed nor the city outside. It was distinct, singular, intentional. She backed away, letting her hand linger on the cool metal. In her mind, the scattered pieces began to coalesce. Scuff marks, U-turn tire tracks, fingerprints, tiny scratches, hidden papers, photos, subtle temperature variations, deliberate holes in walls. Each clue alone was inconsequential, but together they painted a network of activity invisible to most, leaving only delicate traces for her to interpret. Turning back toward the main bay, Mara noticed the faintest shift in the fog outside, movement along the perimeter beyond the fence. A shadow, low and indistinct, slipped behind a stack of pallets. It vanished before she could identify it, but the impression remained, like a residue of presence. She paused, considering the weight of unnoticed hands guiding the night's movements, quiet but deliberate. The depot office now seemed distant, though the lights still glimmered through the fog. Mara's footsteps echoed softly along the concrete as she retraced her path, each subtle sound amplified in the stillness. Somewhere along the back lot, she caught the glint of something metallic embedded in the mud, a small, flat plate, partially obscured by tire tracks. She knelt, brushing the debris away carefully. Its edges were beveled, corners worn, engraved with a series of numbers and letters too precise to be random. She rose, holding the plate against her chest, listening to the faint rhythm of the dripping water, the hum of distant generators, the soft scuffing of tires settling into the wet lot. The depot was alive with invisible hands, deliberate movements, patterns unfolding slowly in space and time. Each detail was a whisper, a hint that the narrative of the night was not yet complete, a story told in shadows, scratches, and subtle disruptions, waiting for someone patient enough to follow the quiet trail. And Mara knew the trail was far from over. Mara stepped back from the metallic plate, letting it rest against her jacket as her eyes swept across the lot. The fog had thickened, and distant headlights from a passing truck cut through the gray like a knife, casting long, shifting shadows that seemed to crawl over the asphalt. She noticed a faint reflection off a puddle near the chain-link fence, something small and angular jutting just above the waterline. Kneeling, she found a corner of metal, a bracket or clip, slightly rusted but deliberately bent. The shape suggested it had been pried off something, left behind either accidentally or with a quiet intention. She followed the fence line toward a storage shed at the far end of the lot. The shed was old, paint peeling, with a roof sagging in the middle. Its padlock had been twisted and repositioned, the keyhole smooth and worn. Inside, the air smelled of mildew and cedar, faintly sweet, and the dim light of her flashlight revealed rows of shelves lined with containers she hadn't seen on the depot's inventory. One shelf held small bottles of liquid, each capped tightly and labeled in a neat, consistent hand, though the labels were coded, symbols Mara didn't immediately recognize. She ran her gloved fingers over the bottles, noting a subtle warmth in one cluster, almost imperceptible, as if the contents had been disturbed recently. Near the back of the shed, she spotted a bundle of coiled rope tucked beneath a wooden pallet. One coil had a frayed end, slightly darkened, like it had been in contact with soil or mud. Mara traced its fibers with her fingers, noting the way the strands had been twisted together tightly, then carefully untangled in certain sections. She stood slowly, listening to the distant hum of refrigeration units and the occasional drip from the shed roof. Each sound seemed magnified in the stillness, a rhythm she could almost follow if she concentrated. Leaving the shed, she wandered along the edge of the lot toward the small maintenance building where tools and equipment were stored. The door was slightly ajar, swinging just enough to catch the wind. Inside, the smell of machine oil was stronger, mixed with faint traces of burnt rubber. On a workbench, a single wrench lay out of place, its handle scratched and polished in unusual patterns. Mara picked it up carefully, feeling the cold metal under her glove, and traced the scratches with her fingertip. They were deliberate, almost like a coded sequence, repeated at regular intervals along the handle. She glanced upward at the pegboard above the bench, noting a series of hooks that held tools in precise alignment. One hook, however, was empty, though a faint shadow suggested a tool had hung there recently. On the floor beneath it, a smear of dust was displaced, as if someone had knelt there, moving deliberately but quietly, leaving only the faintest impression. Mara crouched, examining the mark, realizing the shape mirrored the wrench she held now, a small, deliberate repetition of motion captured in the dust. Moving toward the back corner of the maintenance building, she noticed a narrow hatch, its edges worn and polished. The hatch opened into a crawl space beneath the building. The air inside was cool and damp, carrying a metallic scent and a faint trace of machine grease. She followed the crawl space carefully, her flashlight illuminating small details, scratches along the wood, tiny nails driven at angles that suggested repeated adjustment, a narrow channel worn into the dirt floor, as though something heavy had been slid along it multiple times. At the end of the crawl space, Mara found a small metal box, partially buried under debris. She brushed away dirt and dust, revealing a combination lock, its numbers faintly worn from frequent use. The box hummed faintly with residual warmth, as though it had been opened recently. She noted its placement carefully, leaving it undisturbed for now, aware that the presence of heat suggested recent activity in a location that should have been abandoned and quiet. She crawled back into the main area of the building, pausing to take in the patterns of movement etched into the walls and floors, subtle grooves, faint scuffs, the precise arrangement of tools, all suggesting a rhythm and purpose she couldn't yet name. Outside, the fog had begun to thin slightly, revealing the silhouettes of trucks and pallets, yet the lot still felt almost alive, as if someone, or something, had orchestrated its layout overnight. Her attention was drawn to the small office at the side of the building, windows streaked with condensation. She pushed open the door slowly, stepping inside. The room smelled of old paper and ink. On the desk lay a stack of delivery manifests, each page meticulously filled, but some had subtle discrepancies. A column of numbers slightly misaligned, faint pencil markings in the margins. She flipped through the pages slowly, noticing patterns forming in the deviations, small enough to be overlooked by anyone not paying close attention. From the window, Mara observed a narrow alley running along the side of the depot, lined with dumpsters and discarded crates. One crate had been shifted slightly, leaving a narrow gap along the wall. She approached, brushing aside trash and debris, revealing a small, weathered notebook wedged inside. Its cover was torn, edges frayed, and inside, the pages held sketches of the depot layout, some annotated with faint measurements, others with cryptic symbols she couldn't yet decipher. Mara ran her finger along one sketch, noticing how the lines matched subtle scratches she had seen in the maintenance building, the scratches along the floor, and the grooves in the crawlspace. Each mark, each notation, was a quiet echo of activity, deliberate yet hidden, creating a network of clues that only patience and observation could unravel. The night pressed on, quiet but full of whispers. Mara paused at the alley's entrance, listening to the distant hum of refrigeration units, the faint drip of water from the roof, the subtle shift of the wind against the chain-link fence. Every sound, every shadow, every trace she had found so far seemed connected, yet the connection remained just out of reach, like a melody half-remembered. She walked back toward the main depot, the small notebook tucked carefully in her jacket. Each step was measured, each observation catalogued silently in her mind. The lot, the sheds, the maintenance building, the alley, every space carried the faint imprint of deliberate hands, careful movements, and the subtle orchestration of someone who moved through the night with intent. Mara paused at the center of the lot, looking at the van one last time before heading toward the office. Its scuffed doors and tire marks seemed more pronounced now, almost deliberate messages in the quiet of the fog. She realized that each discovery, no matter how small, was part of a language she was only beginning to understand, a quiet, deliberate conversation left in shadows, scratches, and faint traces, meant to be uncovered slowly, piece by piece. And as she walked back, she felt the weight of observation pressing against her, subtle and constant, knowing the night still held more secrets, just out of reach, waiting for her to notice them. Mara moved through the depot lot with the quiet patience of someone listening to a space rather than simply walking through it. The fog had lifted slightly, leaving a thin veil of dampness that made the asphalt glisten faintly under the pale glow of the streetlights. She noticed, almost instinctively, the way the rainwater had pooled along the edge of the lot, forming thin rivulets that traced the cracks in the concrete like delicate, deliberate lines. Kneeling, she followed one of these channels with her fingertip, noting tiny impressions at regular intervals, small, almost imperceptible depressions that suggested someone had dragged something along the surface, a weight neither heavy nor cumbersome, moved with measured care. Curiosity drew her toward the corner of the lot where the fencing met the adjacent warehouse. She had passed it before, but never fully examined the narrow service doorway hidden there. The paint was chipped, exposing splintered wood beneath. As she pressed her hand against the frame, a faint vibration ran through the door, almost imperceptible but deliberate. She crouched, letting her ear rest near the gap between the door and the threshold, and caught a soft scrape of metal, a whisper of motion from inside. No footsteps followed, no shuffle of crates, only that precise, rhythmic scrape. Inside the small service corridor, the smell was different, cleaner, with a faint tang of industrial solvents, mingling oddly with the usual odor of damp concrete and machine oil. Shelves lined the walls, stocked with boxes of labels, rolls of tape, and coiled cords. Mara traced a row of cords with her gloved fingers, noticing a faint polish along certain lengths, as though hands had guided them repeatedly along the same path. One cord ended abruptly, frayed, with a subtle bend that suggested deliberate manipulation. At the far end of the corridor, she spotted a small hatch in the floor, set flush with the concrete. The metal was warm to the touch, a sharp contrast to the cool air around it. She knelt to examine it and saw fine scratches along the edge, forming a near-perfect semicircle, evidence that someone had opened it countless times, carefully, deliberately, without leaving more obvious marks. The thought made her pause. All these minor disturbances were patterns of activity, choreographed in silence. Sliding the hatch open cautiously, she peered into the shallow crawlspace below. It smelled faintly of dust and earth, with a hint of something metallic, almost electrical. The concrete floor beneath was pocked with tiny indentations, small divots forming a subtle trail leading to a narrow pipe running along the wall. Mara traced the pipe with her hand, noticing that several clamps had been adjusted recently, their edges clean, polished in contrast to the surrounding corrosion. Someone had moved through here with intent, manipulating the infrastructure itself. Returning to the corridor, she noticed a narrow gap in the shelving at eye level. Behind it, a small ledge held a set of envelopes, each marked with neat, handwritten symbols. One envelope was slightly askew. She lifted it carefully, revealing a folded piece of graph paper inside, covered in faint lines and measurements. The diagram was precise but cryptic, depicting angles and distances that mirrored the layout of the lot and warehouse. Mara traced the lines with her finger, feeling the quiet deliberation that had gone into planning this map, noting that even the smallest measurements had been attended to. Exiting the corridor, she moved along the perimeter of the warehouse, passing the old loading docks now slick with rain. One dock, she noticed, had a small notch in its edge, worn smooth, almost polished. Kneeling, she ran her fingers along it, detecting a thin streak of residue, dirt, paint, and a faint trace of oil. The mark suggested repeated contact with machinery or equipment, slid carefully in a controlled motion. She looked up to the dock's roofline and saw a subtle shadow shifting behind a vent, too vague to identify, but enough to remind her the space was not entirely empty. She wandered toward a small, neglected annex at the back of the property. Its windows were streaked and opaque with grime, and the door creaked faintly as she opened it. Inside, the room smelled of old fabric and dust, with shelves lining the walls filled with boxes of uniform size. One box had been opened, its flaps bent back, and inside she found a series of small tools, calipers, measuring tapes, and a finely honed knife. Each item was placed neatly, in deliberate order, though the edges bore faint signs of use. Mara's eyes drifted to the floor beneath the box. A sequence of scuff marks formed a gentle curve, suggesting someone had knelt and shifted repeatedly, arranging tools without leaving chaos behind. From the annex, she spotted a narrow stairwell descending into a dimly lit basement. The air was cooler here, carrying the faint tang of damp concrete and old oil. She descended slowly, her hand trailing along the railing, noting tiny scratches on the edge, consistent with repeated careful handling. At the bottom, the space opened into a low-ceilinged room lined with metal shelving. Each shelf held identical containers, their surfaces polished in small arcs, the pattern of repetition meticulous. One container was slightly ajar, revealing faint traces of powdered residue inside. Mara tilted her head, noting that the pattern of disturbance was consistent with precise scooping or measurement rather than careless handling. In a corner, the faint outline of footprints and dust led toward a small hatch in the wall, partially obscured by a stack of crates. The impressions were shallow, precise, deliberate, suggesting someone had moved through here frequently, but always with caution. Mara crouched to examine them, noticing subtle variations, pressure points where the heel had pressed more firmly, tiny smears along the edge of the dust where fingertips or tools had brushed lightly against the floor. From somewhere above, she heard a faint metallic hum, irregular but persistent, echoing faintly against the concrete walls. It seemed to move through the space like a slow pulse, and Mara traced it to a vent near the ceiling. Placing her ear close, she felt a subtle vibration along the metal, rhythmic, controlled, almost like a heartbeat. She leaned back, taking in the full weight of the room. Every mark, every groove, every polished edge, every faint smell, all spoke of someone who had moved through here deliberately, leaving fragments, patterns, and echoes for those patient enough to notice. Rising slowly, Mara allowed herself a quiet breath. The basement, The annex, the corridors, the crawl spaces, the lot, all were connected by traces too subtle for casual observation, a network of quiet choreography unfolding across space and time. She ran her hand along a metal shelf, feeling the faint warmth left behind by recent activity, and realized that every step she had taken that night, every discovery she had made, was part of a deliberate, careful story. Outside, the fog had begun to creep back in, curling along the edges of the warehouse and lot, softening lines, swallowing details, leaving only the faintest impressions of movement and presence. Mara turned back toward the stairwell, notebook tucked safely against her chest, mind cataloging the layers she had uncovered. Each subtle clue, each deliberate mark, was part of an invisible conversation, and the narrative of the night remained incomplete, whispering its story to her alone in the quiet. And somewhere in the shadows beyond the depot, the night held its secrets close, patient, deliberate, watching, waiting for her to notice the next trace. Mara lingered at the base of the basement stairwell, listening to the faint hum of the vent and the subtle drip of water from somewhere unseen. The air was damp and heavy, carrying the scent of earth and metal, tinged with the faintest hint of oil. She ran her gloved fingers along the railing one more time, noticing a series of tiny scratches near the bottom, almost like someone had used it as a guide for a precise movement, repeating it countless times over the weeks. She rose slowly, her boots echoing softly on the concrete stairs, and moved toward the far corner of the basement where a narrow doorway led into what appeared to be a storage annex. The air shifted as she entered, warmer here, carrying the faint scent of cardboard and dust. Rows of shelves lined the walls, some stacked high with unmarked boxes, others with crates labeled in a handwriting she didn't recognize. One crate had a tiny notch in its corner, polished smooth as though a tool had been inserted and removed repeatedly. On the floor near the crate, Mara noticed a series of subtle scratches forming an irregular grid. She crouched, brushing away dust, revealing patterns that seemed almost deliberate, yet not easily decipherable. The lines ran parallel for a few inches, then shifted slightly, creating a sequence that repeated at irregular intervals. She traced the marks with her fingertips, sensing the careful hands that must have crafted them, the rhythm of movement behind the faint grooves. At eye level, a shelf held a row of small metal boxes, their surfaces worn in arcs as if handled frequently. One box protruded slightly more than the others. Mara reached for it, lifting it gently. Inside, she found a bundle of folded papers, edges frayed, covered in cryptic measurements and diagrams. Her eyes traced the lines. Some mirrored the lot outside. Some matched the interior shelving patterns, while others seemed to map something unseen, a spatial choreography only partially revealed. The faint hum from the vent above persisted, irregular but rhythmic. Mara's attention shifted to a small vent grate near the floor, its metal edges polished faintly in spots. Pressing her ear close, she caught the soft movement of air, almost imperceptible, carrying a faint metallic scrape somewhere deep within the wall. She pressed her hand against the grate, feeling subtle vibrations, and realized the space itself had been altered, manipulated, perhaps to carry signals or simply to mark passage. From the corner of the basement, a narrow crawl space revealed itself behind a stack of boxes. The entry was low, requiring her to crouch fully, and the air was cooler here, heavier with the scent of damp concrete. She crawled slowly, flashlight revealing small details. Tiny nails hammered at precise intervals, faint scratches along the floor, a narrow groove worn into the dirt. Each mark suggested repeated passage, careful adjustment, and a deliberate path through an otherwise unnoticed space. At the end of the crawl space, she found a small hatch in the floor. The metal was cold but faintly worn, polished along the edges from repeated handling. She knelt and ran her fingers across it, noting a subtle pattern of scratches, semicircular, deliberate. It was a quiet signature of human presence, an echo of movement across time, repeated so often that it had left a tangible rhythm in the material itself. Crawling back into the basement proper, she noticed a faint trail of residue along the edge of a shelf. Dust displaced, fine scratches along the concrete, tiny flecks of paint. Following it, she arrived at a section of shelving that had been recently adjusted. Crates had shifted slightly, leaving narrow gaps in the line of boxes. Inside one, she discovered a bundle of small metal clips, worn at the edges, each bent just enough to suggest repeated use. The pattern of wear was precise, controlled, purposeful. She paused, listening. The basement was still, yet alive with subtle cues, a faint hum, the soft drip of water, the echo of distant machinery. Every mark, every scratch, every subtle shift in dust or warmth was a message, a trace left by someone careful, deliberate, and patient. Mara noted the rhythm of the movement, the choreography of absent hands, and felt the weight of the unseen presence that had orchestrated it all. Rising, she moved toward a narrow stairwell tucked in the corner of the basement, leading up to a small mezzanine. The steps were worn in the center, polished smooth from repeated use. On the mezzanine, crates and boxes were arranged with geometric precision. One crate had a faint smear along its side, blue in color, subtle, almost invisible except when caught by the flashlight at an angle. Mara crouched, noting tiny imprints along the smear, as though fingertips or tools had pressed lightly against the surface. A ladder leaned against the far wall, its rungs polished along the center, and above it, a narrow opening led to a small loft. She climbed carefully, feeling the subtle vibrations of the ladder beneath her hands and feet, noting the faint scratches that aligned with the direction of her ascent. At the loft's edge, she looked down at the mezzanine below. A pattern emerged, almost invisible from the floor, a sequence of disturbances and dust, were marks on crates, faint lines of residue, all mapping out movements she could not yet fully interpret. The loft itself was narrow and low, lined with old beams and cobwebbed corners. Among the stored materials, she noticed a single envelope tucked behind a stack of crates. Its edges were frayed, the paper thin, almost translucent, with faint pencil markings along the fold. She picked it up, feeling the subtle weight of something inside. A folded piece of paper containing measurements and notations, diagrams of interior spaces, some matching the lot, some mapping unseen corridors, pathways, and hidden adjustments. From the loft, Mara could hear the distant murmur of the night beyond the warehouse walls, a faint shift in wind across the depot lot, and the subtle creak of metal overhead as the structure settled. She traced her eyes along the rafters, noting small notches and marks, faint as if a ladder or pulley had been used to reach high points repeatedly. Each notch, each scratch, was a whisper of deliberate movement, a language of presence without voice. Descending back to the mezzanine, Mara paused near the edge, taking in the weight of observation she had gathered, the scuff marks on the van, the U-turn in the lot, fingerprints on notebooks, subtle scratches along doors and floors, polished metal from repeated handling, diagrams hidden in envelopes, minor shifts in crates, and the faint traces of movement through crawl spaces and lofts. All of it spoke of careful orchestration, subtle manipulation, and patient choreography. Outside, the fog thickened once more, curling along the warehouse walls, softening the edges of shadows, swallowing the faint reflections of light and puddles. Mara stepped to the mezzanine railing, looking down over the lot, listening to the soft drip of water, the faint hum of machinery, the rhythm of a space alive with invisible hands. Each discovery she had made that night was a single phrase in a quiet dialogue, one she was only beginning to understand, and she knew the night still held countless fragments yet to be uncovered. She drew a slow breath, feeling the weight of the observations pressing gently against her mind. The sense that every subtle detail was part of a network, deliberate and patient, leading somewhere just beyond the reach of perception. The depot, the basement, the loft, the corridors, the crawl spaces, all of it seemed to pulse with intent, silent but alive, and Mara, moving quietly through it, felt herself drawn further into its careful, unfolding story. Mara lingered in the loft, her flashlight cutting narrow beams across the low ceiling, illuminating the dust motes drifting slowly in the still air. The beams caught subtle textures in the wood, tiny grooves along the beams, worn patches where hands or tools had repeatedly pressed, and faint stains, almost imperceptible, that seemed to follow a careful, deliberate path along the rafters. She traced one groove with her gloved fingertip, feeling the rhythm of repeated contact, as though the wood itself had absorbed the memory of movement. Descending carefully to the mezzanine, she stepped toward the far wall where a narrow storage closet was recessed into a shadowed corner. The door was slightly ajar, revealing a faint glint of metal inside. She leaned forward, pushing it open, and saw rows of small metal boxes, each identical, neatly lined up. One box protruded slightly, edges polished. Mara lifted it gently and found a thin coil of wire inside, wound with careful precision. Alongside it, a small folded piece of cloth, worn at the edges and faintly stained, suggested repeated handling. She examined it closely but could detect no scent, no overt sign of its previous use. She moved on, letting her gaze drift over the mezzanine floor. Dust patterns revealed subtle shifts, footprints, smudges, the delicate arc of a hand dragging lightly across a crate. Mara traced them with her fingers, observing how the marks intersected with previous discoveries, forming an invisible map of motion through the space. A faint line of residue led her toward a corner where a stack of wooden pallets leaned against the wall. One pallet had been shifted slightly, leaving a narrow gap just wide enough to peer behind. Inside, she found a small collection of notebooks, stacked carefully, their pages marked with neat, deliberate symbols and shorthand notations. One had a faint smudge along the edge, the imprint of a fingerprint almost invisible to the casual eye. She turned the pages slowly, noting diagrams of shelving layouts, subtle notes about distances between crates, markings that suggested measurements made repeatedly over time. It was meticulous, controlled, every mark intentional, every adjustment precise. The faint hum of the building seemed to guide her next steps. She followed the sound to a small staircase at the edge of the mezzanine, descending into a low-ceilinged hallway she had not noticed before. The air here was cooler, carrying a faint scent of machine oil and damp concrete. Along the walls, she observed tiny drill holes, perfectly spaced, some containing small metal pins. Their purpose was unclear, but their regularity suggested design, an order she could sense but not yet interpret. A door at the end of the hallway was slightly warped at the edges. Mara pressed her hand to the frame, noticing a faint vibration, subtle but intentional, like the echo of movement from the other side. She eased the door open and found a small room, narrow, lined with racks of equipment she hadn't seen cataloged in depot inventories. Most were ordinary tools, yet each one bore signs of careful placement. Scratches along handles and repeated arcs, the faintest polish along edges where hands had held them, marks that suggested deliberate use without carelessness. Near the center of the room, a low table held a collection of envelopes, some sealed, others partially opened. She picked one up, carefully, and found folded diagrams inside, sketches of the depot lot, the warehouse, shelving arrangements, even the paths she had taken that night, overlaid with measurements, arrows, and subtle annotations she couldn't yet fully decipher. Each fold, each crease, carried evidence of repeated consultation. It was a quiet map of human movement through the space, a record of activity both deliberate and hidden. Mara noticed a faint shift in temperature along the far wall, near a metal panel. Pressing her hand to it, she felt subtle warmth in certain areas, almost like residual heat from recent handling. A thin groove ran along the panel's edge, polished, almost imperceptible. She traced it slowly, noting the direction and rhythm of repeated contact, the intentionality embedded in the metal. Her attention drifted upward. A small ventilation grate near the ceiling had been loosened slightly, edges smooth. The screws partially unscrewed and reinserted. Mara tilted her head, listening. Faint movements whispered through the ducts, a rhythm irregular but deliberate. She could feel the vibration through the metal, faint, controlled, as if the air itself had been used to mark presence. From the corner of the room, a narrow crawl space beckoned. The opening was low, almost hidden behind a shelf of stacked crates. She crawled in slowly, flashlight cutting along the dirt floor. Tiny nail marks, shallow grooves, and faint scratches mapped a path, subtle but precise. At the end, a small metal hatch revealed itself, its edges worn smooth from repeated handling. Pressing her fingers along it, she felt the faint warmth of recent contact. The hatch hummed faintly under her touch, resonating with the careful, hidden activity that had taken place. Returning to the main room, Mara paused to take in the details. The envelopes, diagrams, scratches, grooves, residual warmth, faint hums, polished edges, and subtle displacements of objects. Each discovery was small, almost imperceptible alone, yet together they formed a lattice of movement, intention, and observation. The space was alive with deliberate gestures, each echoing the invisible presence of someone who had orchestrated them with meticulous care. She moved toward the hallway leading back to the mezzanine, stepping lightly over faint footprints in dust. Each step was cataloged silently in her mind, connecting past observations, the van scuff marks, the U-turn in the lot, fingerprints in the notebooks, faint smears, subtle warmth, the crawlspace path, the loft, the mezzanine. Mara realized the patterns repeated, overlapped, and intertwined, forming a choreography that was deliberate yet elusive, precise yet imperceptible unless one knew to look. Outside, through a small window high in the wall, the fog had returned, curling along the warehouse edges, softening shadows, swallowing the faint glint of lights and puddles. Mara leaned against the wall, notebook and diagrams tucked against her chest, breathing slowly. Every subtle mark, every polished edge, every faint vibration was a line of dialogue, a quiet signature, a deliberate trace left in spaces otherwise ignored. And the night pressed on, patient and deliberate. Somewhere beyond the walls of the depot, the unseen hands that had orchestrated this quiet choreography were still there, leaving fragments, echoes, and traces, each one waiting to be noticed. Mara knew the story was far from complete, and with each discovery, the quiet pull of the unknown drew her deeper into the careful, unhurried rhythm of the night. Mara stepped back from the mezzanine, pausing to let her eyes adjust to the dim light filtering through the small high windows. The warehouse below was hushed, but every surface seemed to carry traces of movement. Subtle abrasions along crate edges, faint dust patterns, minute scuffs on the floorboards. She crouched near one of the beams that ran diagonally across the mezzanine, running her fingers along it and feeling the tiny grooves that traced repeated contact. Someone had been here, she realized, moving carefully, deliberately, leaving behind a quiet record of their passage. She followed a narrow catwalk at the edge of the mezzanine, its metal grating faintly vibrating under her boots. Beneath it, the warehouse floor stretched like a darkened canvas, littered with pallets, crates, and a few stray pieces of equipment. From this vantage, Mara noticed a subtle shift in one stack of pallets near the rear dock. They leaned slightly to one side, leaving a thin shadowed gap along the wall. The alignment was almost imperceptible, yet it drew her attention, suggesting movement that had not been random. Sliding carefully along the catwalk, she peered into the gap. A small bundle of folded tarps had been tucked behind the pallets. Their edges were worn, faintly frayed, and a thin layer of dust covered them, disturbed in a pattern that suggested someone had been lifting and replacing them repeatedly. Beneath the tarps, a small metal box peeked out. Mara reached for it, brushing away the debris, noting its edges polished from repeated handling. It hummed faintly, warm to the touch, and she realized that someone had recently used it, left it intentionally positioned but almost hidden. Returning to the mezzanine, she moved toward a narrow doorway she had not noticed before. The door was unmarked, blending into the wall, its surface cool and unyielding. She pushed it open slowly, revealing a small room with concrete walls and a low ceiling. Dust clung to every surface, but faint marks in the layers revealed activity. Smudged footprints along the floor, slight scratches along the walls, a subtle depression in the center where someone had knelt repeatedly. On a low shelf along one wall, a row of small envelopes rested in precise alignment. One envelope protruded slightly, its flap worn and edges frayed. Mara lifted it and found diagrams inside, marked with symbols and measurements she did not immediately recognize. The paper had been folded carefully, unfolded repeatedly, leaving faint creases as evidence of handling. Some notations corresponded with subtle scratches she had seen along the mezzanine beams, others with minor scuffs on the warehouse floor. A pattern was emerging, quiet and deliberate, but still opaque. A narrow vent near the ceiling caught her attention. Its grate had been loosened and polished in select spots, the screws partially unscrewed and reinserted. Mara pressed her ear to the vent, hearing faint, irregular vibrations. They were subtle, almost like a slow, measured pulse running through the ductwork. She ran her fingers along the edges of the grate, noting warmth and slight traces of residue. The vent had been touched, adjusted, manipulated. An invisible hand had left its signature here as well. Exiting the small room, she found herself in a hallway she had not noticed before, narrow and dimly lit. The walls were lined with storage lockers, some closed tightly, others slightly ajar. Mara passed each, noting subtle details, scratches along edges, faint impressions in dust, marks that suggested items had been removed and returned with care. One locker door had a faint polish along the handle, nearly imperceptible, evidence of repeated use. Inside, she discovered a folded piece of graph paper tucked behind a row of cans. It contained measurements, angles, subtle diagrams of spaces she had already explored: the mezzanine, the loft, the crawl space, interconnected with lines she could not yet fully interpret. At the end of the hallway, a narrow stairwell led down to a sublevel she had not accessed. The steps were worn in the center, polished and smooth, each tread echoing faintly under her careful steps. The air was cooler here, carrying a faint metallic scent mixed with dust. As she descended, she noticed tiny marks along the wall, almost like fingertip impressions in the concrete. They formed a sequence, deliberate, controlled, suggesting repeated tracing, a pattern intended to guide or communicate subtly. At the base of the stairwell, a door led to a small storage chamber. The room was narrow, walls lined with shelves bearing crates and containers, some unmarked, others with faded labels. Mara moved slowly through the space, noting subtle signs of human activity, slight depressions in the dust, scratches along crate edges, faint smudges on handles. One crate had a thin smear of dark residue along its side, almost imperceptible, yet its direction and curvature suggested deliberate contact. She crouched near it, brushing the surface lightly, discovering a faint trail of tiny flecks, blue and silver, speckled in a pattern too consistent to be accidental. The trail led toward the back corner of the chamber, where a narrow hatch in the floor caught her attention. Its metal was cold but polished along the edges, the faint warmth indicating recent handling. She pressed her hand to it, feeling subtle vibrations beneath the surface. The hatch, like so many other elements she had discovered, bore the evidence of someone moving with care, leaving traces that were quiet but deliberate. Standing again, Mara surveyed the chamber. The crates, the faint residue, the small flecks, the hatch, and the subtle signs of repeated, precise movement. Each observation linked to the others, forming a web of activity she could feel but not yet fully interpret. Outside, the fog pressed against the building, muffling distant sounds, softening edges, and leaving only hints of light reflected in the wet surfaces. She turned back toward the stairwell, moving slowly, cataloging every minor detail: smudges, scratches, residues, diagrams, impressions in dust, faint warmth. Each trace was a note in a silent conversation, part of a deliberate choreography she was beginning to understand, but one that remained incomplete, teasing her with the careful precision of unseen hands. The night outside remained patient, deliberate, full of hidden rhythms. Mara felt the weight of the space pressing around her, subtle and constant, and knew that the depot held more secrets than she had yet uncovered. Every small mark, every shift in dust, every faint vibration was a breadcrumb leading her deeper into a quiet story still unfolding, layer by layer, in the stillness of the fog and shadow. Mara lingered at the base of the storage chamber, the polished edges of the hatch beneath her hand faintly warm, the subtle vibrations still pulsing through the metal. She crouched, tracing the worn contours of the floor around it, noticing a delicate line of dust displaced in a curve that led to the corner where crates leaned against one another. The pattern was deliberate, small, almost imperceptible traces left behind, as though to mark passage or orientation. Slowly, she stood, feeling the quiet patience of the space pressing around her. She moved toward a narrow corridor she had not yet explored, tucked behind a row of stacked crates near the chamber's far wall. The air grew cooler and carried the faint smell of damp cardboard. The floor was slightly uneven, and her boots made soft echoes against the concrete. Along the base of the walls, she noticed shallow indentations, worn smooth in arcs, and tiny flecks of residue embedded in the concrete. They formed a subtle path, suggesting careful navigation through a space otherwise unnoticed. At the corridor's end, a low doorway opened into a small, dimly lit utility room. Pipes ran along the ceiling in tight bundles, some wrapped in insulation that had been carefully replaced in sections, marked with faint pencil notations. Mara ran her fingers along one pipe, noting the polish left by repeated contact. The air was tinged with a faint metallic scent, mixed with the subtle tang of cleaning solvents. On a low shelf, she found small jars filled with unknown powders, their lids carefully tightened. One jar had a thin streak across the surface, subtle but consistent, as though someone had drawn a fingertip across it multiple times. She knelt to examine the streak more closely. The powder beneath it was disturbed in a pattern that seemed deliberate, a series of arcs and dots forming an abstract rhythm. Mara traced it with her fingertip, feeling the gentle abrasion of the powder against her glove, sensing the invisible hand that had moved here with care and repetition. Rising, she looked around the room more carefully. Faint smudges along the walls, slight were along the edges of a metal workbench, scratches on the concrete floor that suggested repeated, deliberate placement of heavy objects. Moving onward, Mara noticed a narrow stairwell tucked behind the utility room's far wall. Its steps were worn and polished in the center, echoing softly under her boots. The handrail bore faint grooves where fingers had pressed in a consistent, patterned manner. She descended slowly, taking in the subtle details, noting how the stairwell narrowed at the bottom into a low-ceiling basement space she had not yet explored. The air here was cooler, tinged with the faint scent of wet stone and rust. At the base, she discovered a series of shallow depressions in the floor, forming a grid-like pattern, irregular but deliberate. Following them carefully, she found a small trapdoor hidden beneath a layer of dust. The metal was cold but faintly worn, polished along the edges from repeated use. Mara pressed her palm to it, sensing subtle vibrations beneath the surface. She lifted the door carefully, revealing a narrow crawl space beyond. The crawl space was low, forcing her to crawl slowly. The dirt floor bore faint tracks, grooves, and scratches along the edges, suggesting careful movement through a confined space. A faint metallic tang lingered in the air, and Mara noticed small, shallow impressions along the walls, possibly left by hands steadying movement. At the far end, a tiny hatch embedded in the wall caught her attention. Its edges were worn smooth, faintly warm, and she could feel a delicate vibration under her fingers. Emerging from the crawl space, Mara found herself in a long, narrow maintenance tunnel she had not encountered before. The walls were lined with pipes and conduits, some polished, some bearing faint scratches where hands or tools had repeatedly pressed. She moved cautiously along the tunnel, noticing how the light from her flashlight reflected off small metal tags attached to the pipes. One tag had subtle notations etched into it, numbers and letters faintly visible in the dim illumination. A series of small boxes along the tunnel's floor drew her attention. One had been shifted slightly, revealing the outline of a shallow groove beneath, as though something had been slid in and out repeatedly. Mara knelt, running her fingers along the groove, feeling the fine abrasion in the concrete. The movement had been precise, controlled, deliberate. She stood and traced her eyes along the walls, small holes drilled in sequence, faintly polished, perhaps for wiring or signaling, creating a subtle pattern she could sense more than see. At the tunnel's end, a door led to a quiet annex she had never noticed before. The room smelled faintly of dust and old oil. Crates and boxes were arranged meticulously along the walls, some shifted slightly, leaving narrow gaps that suggested recent activity. Mara moved carefully through the space, noting the faint impressions of feet in dust, scratches along crate edges, and subtle smudges where hands had touched repeatedly. One small box in the corner had a streak of residue along its side, faintly blue, nearly imperceptible, its curvature deliberate, almost a signature. She approached a narrow ladder against the far wall, its rungs polished in arcs from repeated use. Climbing slowly, she reached a loft space above the annex. The air was cooler here, carrying a faint metallic tang. Beams overhead bore faint, repetitive marks, tiny abrasions where hands had pressed or tools had moved along them. In the loft, a single envelope lay hidden behind a stack of old crates. Its edges were frayed, the paper thin, with subtle pencil markings along the folds. Mara unfolded it carefully, revealing diagrams and measurements she could not yet fully decipher. Subtle sketches of corridors, shelving layouts, and pathways she had observed, interconnected by faint annotations and lines, a quiet map of deliberate human movement. Below, the faint hum of machinery echoed softly through the warehouse, blending with the drip of water from a distant pipe and the irregular creak of settling beams. Mara traced her eyes across the space. Every mark, every polished edge, every faint smudge and groove formed a lattice of activity, deliberate but invisible to anyone not watching closely. She stepped back, cataloging the observations in her mind. The scratches, the residual warmth, the diagrams, the scuffs on the floors and stairs, the faint metallic tang, the delicate streaks in dust and powder, the footprints and impressions in crawl spaces, lofts, mezzanines, and annexes. Outside, fog curled along the warehouse walls, softening edges, swallowing light, muting distant sounds. Mara moved to the mezzanine railing, notebook tucked carefully against her chest, breathing slowly, aware that each subtle trace she had observed was part of a quiet story still unfolding. The depot seemed alive with careful, patient orchestration, invisible hands leaving traces for her to follow, and she felt, as she looked out into the obscured lot, that the night held still more secrets, small, deliberate, and waiting patiently to be noticed. Mara descended from the mezzanine, her boots making soft impressions in the dust that coated the concrete floor. She moved toward a corridor she had only glimpsed before, narrow and lined with unmarked doors, each blending into the shadows. The air was cooler here, carrying the faint scent of metal and damp stone, layered with the subtle tang of cardboard from nearby crates. As she stepped forward, her flashlight caught a faint smudge along the base of one door, nearly invisible, a slight sheen from repeated contact. She knelt, examining it closely. The smudge formed a subtle curve along the edge, as though someone had pressed against it gently, several times in succession. Above it, a small scratch in the paint ran diagonally, shallow but deliberate, a mark left by a careful hand rather than by accident. The combination suggested movement that had been cautious yet deliberate, a choreography she could sense more than see. The corridor opened into a small storage room at the far end. The air was still, almost oppressive, carrying a faint mix of dust, oil, and the faint tang of metal. Crates lined the walls, some shifted slightly, leaving narrow gaps that created faint shadows on the floor. Mara crouched to inspect them, noting the subtle marks on the concrete, smudges, shallow scratches, slight depressions. One crate, in particular, bore a streak of gray powder along its side, faint and carefully placed, forming a gentle arc that seemed intentional, a signature of repeated handling. Near the back wall, she found a low hatch, almost flush with the floor. Its edges were smooth, polished from repeated use, faintly warm where someone had touched it recently. Mara pressed her hand to it, feeling a subtle vibration beneath the metal, an echo of movement left behind. The hatch suggested a passage or access point rarely used by others, but manipulated deliberately by someone familiar with the space. Sliding the hatch open, she discovered a narrow crawl space, barely wide enough to move through comfortably. The floor beneath was uneven, and dust traced faint lines along the edges where someone had crawled before. Small nail marks ran in a sequence along the wall, interrupted by shallow scratches in the dirt floor. Mara traced them slowly, noting how the patterns formed a quiet path, deliberate and methodical, as though the space itself had been mapped over time. At the end of the crawl space, she found a small metal panel set into the wall. Its edges bore subtle abrasions, polished where someone had touched repeatedly. A faint warmth lingered beneath the surface, evidence of recent handling. Mara pressed her ear to it and felt a soft vibration, irregular but deliberate, like a muted signal or rhythm. She traced the panel's edges with her fingertips, sensing the care with which it had been moved, adjusted, and replaced countless times. Emerging from the crawl space, Mara followed a narrow staircase leading to a section of the warehouse she had not yet explored. The steps were smooth in the center from repeated use, each tread echoing softly under her boots. At the top, she entered a low-ceilinged annex filled with shelves and crates. The air was heavy with dust, but faint traces revealed recent activity. Slight scuff marks along the floor, smudges on crate surfaces, and subtle streaks of residue along edges. One crate, slightly ajar, revealed a small bundle of papers tied with twine, edges worn, diagrams marked with faint pencil notations. She picked up the bundle carefully, noting the sketches inside, diagrams of the warehouse, the mezzanine, crawl spaces, and annexes, interlinked by lines and symbols she could not yet fully interpret. Certain markings corresponded to scratches she had seen on floors and beams. Others seemed to map pathways she had only glimpsed. The diagrams suggested someone had studied the movement of the space carefully, leaving subtle traces that only a patient observer could follow. From a corner of the annex, a narrow vent near the ceiling caught her attention. Its edges were polished where screws had been adjusted repeatedly. Mara pressed her ear to the vent, sensing faint vibrations through the metal. A soft, irregular pulse moved through it, echoing like a quiet heartbeat of the building itself. She traced her fingers along the edges of the vent, feeling the slight warmth of recent contact and the faint presence of residue, a record of unseen hands. Beyond the annex, a small stairwell descended into yet another hidden chamber. The air grew cooler as she moved down, carrying a faint metallic tang mingled with the scent of damp stone and old oil. The walls bore tiny, shallow impressions, fingerprints embedded in dust, grooves along edges, small punctures that seemed deliberate. Each mark was a whisper of presence, quiet and patient, marking passage without drawing attention. The chamber opened into a long, narrow tunnel lined with pipes and conduits. Some pipes were polished, some bore faint scratches along their length. On the floor, small boxes had been shifted, leaving shallow grooves in the concrete. Mara followed them slowly, sensing the rhythm of repeated movement, noting the faint residue of powder or dust along the edges. Small metal tags attached to the pipes bore faint notations, cryptic numbers, and letters etched with care. At the tunnel's end, a door led to another annex, filled with crates stacked with geometric precision. Dust patterns revealed recent activity, faint footprints, smudges on edges, scratches in the floor. One crate bore a nearly invisible streak of blue residue, curved deliberately, a small signature. A ladder in the corner led to a loft space above, beams faintly scarred where hands had pressed repeatedly. Mara climbed carefully, finding a single envelope tucked behind crates. Its edges were frayed, pencil markings along the folds, diagrams showing subtle measurements of the spaces she had traversed, the mezzanine, loft, crawl spaces, and annexes, interconnected with lines and faint annotations. The quiet hum of the warehouse persisted, blending with distant machinery, the drip of water from pipes, and the occasional creak of settling beams. Mara observed the space below. Every scratch, scuff, smear, residual warmth, diagram, and subtle displacement formed a lattice of deliberate activity. Outside, the fog pressed against the walls, softening edges, swallowing reflections, muting distant sounds. Mara stood in the loft, notebook pressed to her chest, breathing slowly. She cataloged every subtle trace: the scratches, faint warmth, scuffs on floors and stairs, polished edges, diagrams, smudges, dust patterns, fingerprints, residue streaks, impressions in crawl spaces, lofts, mezzanines, annexes, tunnels, and hidden chambers. Each was a note in a quiet dialogue, a patient orchestration of presence and absence. And as she looked out through a small loft window, the fog curling against the warehouse walls, she sensed that the night had many more secrets yet to reveal. The unseen hands that had moved through the spaces so carefully had left traces, small and deliberate, waiting to be noticed. Mara felt the pull of the unknown, quiet, patient, and inexorably drawing her deeper into a rhythm of deliberate, subtle discovery. Mara lingered at the loft window, the fog curling against the warehouse walls like a quiet tide, and then moved slowly back toward the ladder that led down into the annex. Each rung bore faint polish from repeated use, and her gloves brushed lightly against subtle abrasions, tiny grooves where hands had pressed in a measured rhythm. She descended carefully, cataloging each detail, feeling the weight of the space and the deliberate patterns left behind. In the annex, she paused before a line of crates she had passed earlier. One crate had a faint indentation on its side, nearly imperceptible, where something heavy had pressed and shifted repeatedly. She knelt, brushing dust away, revealing a narrow streak of residue that arced along the edge. almost like a signature left without intention to be seen. The floor beneath held shallow impressions, subtle depressions from repeated kneeling, careful placement of objects, movements made with quiet purpose. Toward the back wall, she noticed a low, narrow doorway she had not seen before, partially hidden behind stacked pallets. Pushing them aside slowly, she peered into a room that smelled faintly of damp wood and oil. Shelves lined the walls, bearing boxes and containers, some unmarked, some labeled with faded, handwritten tags. Mara crouched, observing small details. Dust slightly disturbed along the floor where crates had been shifted, a thin streak of blue powder along a box edge, scuff marks forming gentle arcs. Everything suggested deliberate, repeated action, but not chaos, an ordered, patient choreography of movement. At the far corner, a metal cabinet stood with its doors closed. The edges of the handles were polished faintly, worn from careful use. Mara lifted one, finding inside a collection of envelopes, each folded carefully. One envelope protruded slightly. She took it out, unfolding a diagram. Sketches of the warehouse layout, loft, mezzanine, annexes, crawl spaces, and stairwells she had traversed. Faint lines connected each space, overlaid with symbols and tiny notations she could not yet fully interpret. It was meticulous, quiet, and purposeful, a map of presence through the building. A narrow vent near the ceiling caught her attention. Its edges were worn, screws partially loosened and reinserted, faint polish along the perimeter. Mara pressed her ear against it. A soft, irregular vibration ran through the metal, a subtle pulse, deliberate, like a heartbeat echoing in hidden ducts. She traced her fingers along the vent edges, sensing warmth from recent contact, residue from careful handling, and the invisible hand that had passed through this space repeatedly, leaving subtle signals for those patient enough to notice. Moving deeper into the annex, she found a small stairwell descending further into the basement, a section she had not explored. The steps were worn along the center, smooth from repeated traffic, each echoing softly under her boots. Handrails bore faint grooves where fingers had pressed repeatedly, a rhythm of movement embedded in the material itself. At the bottom, she entered a low-ceilinged room lined with shelves of metal containers. Each container had subtle polish along its edges, faint scratches, and tiny marks of repeated handling. On the floor, dust revealed a path, shallow footprints in a deliberate sequence. One container was slightly ajar, revealing a coil of wire, carefully wound, and a small, worn cloth tied around it. She ran her fingers over the coil, feeling the faint abrasions, signs of careful use. Nearby, shallow scratches in the floor traced arcs and patterns, echoing the movements she had made across lofts, mezzanines, crawl spaces, and annexes. Each mark connected, forming a quiet lattice of deliberate human presence. From a corner, a narrow crawl space beckoned. Its entrance was low and partially hidden by a crate. She crawled inside, the air cooler and heavier, faint traces of damp concrete and metal lingering. Along the floor, small nail marks, grooves, and shallow scratches mapped the path of careful movement. At the far end, a small hatch revealed itself, edges polished, faint warmth lingering from recent handling. Mara pressed her hand to it, feeling subtle vibrations echoing from the hidden space beyond. Emerging back into the main annex, Mara noticed a narrow door tucked behind stacked shelves she had passed before. Opening it, she found a dim corridor lined with lockers and small storage closets. The air smelled faintly of old paper and metal. Dust on the floor held subtle impressions, footprints, small scuff marks, and tiny streaks of residue that traced repeated movements. One locker had a slight polish along its handle. She opened it to find folded papers with faint diagrams of spaces she had already explored, overlaid with symbols and measurements that suggested careful observation and repeated study. She continued down the corridor, discovering a small stairwell leading to a hidden loft space above another annex. The steps were smooth, handrails polished, faint abrasions where fingers had pressed repeatedly. In the loft, beams overhead bore faint scratches, repeated arcs, signs of deliberate movement. Behind a stack of crates, a single envelope lay tucked, its edges frayed, pencil markings along folds, diagrams of stairwells, crawl spaces, lofts, mezzanines, and annexes, interconnected by subtle lines, faint annotations, and measurements. The warehouse hummed softly around her, machinery distant, pipes dripping intermittently, beams creaking with settling weight. Mara took in the space. Scratches, smudges, dust patterns, faint warmth, polished edges, subtle residue, footprints, impressions, streaks, envelopes, diagrams. Each detail was a note in a silent, meticulous conversation. Outside, fog pressed against the warehouse walls, softening light, muting sound, obscuring shapes. Mara pressed her palm against the loft railing, notebook held close, breathing slowly. Each subtle mark, every trace of repeated, deliberate human presence, whispered a quiet story. The unseen hands that had moved through the spaces had left traces waiting for the patient to follow. And she felt, as the fog swirled and settled beyond the walls, that the depot still held countless secrets, small, deliberate, and waiting to be discovered, drawing her deeper into a rhythm of careful, unhurried revelation. Mara lingered in the loft for a long moment, letting her observations settle into a quiet understanding. She had followed the patterns, traced the scratches, examined the subtle shifts in dust and residue, and studied the careful, deliberate marks left in every space she had explored. Slowly, a picture began to form, not sudden or dramatic, but precise in its quietness. She descended the ladder, moving methodically through the annex. The crates, the streaks, the diagrams, they were not the work of a hasty intruder or someone seeking mischief. Each mark had a rhythm, a careful repetition, as though someone had been learning, experimenting, and testing the warehouse itself. The faint scuffs on the floor, the grooves on the handrails, the patterns in dust, they were evidence of repeated, methodical movement, practiced over time. In the storage corridor, Mara paused to examine the envelope she had found behind the lockers. The diagrams now seemed to make sense in sequence. The measurements, the annotations, the subtle lines connecting spaces, they mapped a system of movement, a quiet choreography designed to monitor the depot with minimal intrusion. Whoever had created it had known the building intimately, understood how to move through it, and had left traces not to alarm anyone, but as a record of presence and observation. She realized that the van, the shifted crates, the scuffs, and even the faint warmth of touched surfaces all fit within this pattern. The small, deliberate manipulations were part of a careful routine. Someone had been moving through the spaces over weeks, perhaps months, quietly checking the flow of deliveries, the alignment of shelving, and the integrity of storage, an observer of the depot's rhythms, meticulous and patient. Returning to the mezzanine, Mara ran her fingers along the polished edges of the handrails, recalling the patterns she had traced in the loft and annexes. The marks no longer felt mysterious. They were practical, almost methodical, left by someone who had been maintaining order in a way that left little visible footprint but left a quiet trail for the observant. The U-turn of the van, the scratches on the doors, the arcs in dust, they were all components of someone verifying processes and pathways, checking the flow of the warehouse at times when no one else was present. She walked through the main floor slowly, letting her eyes follow the subtle traces she had cataloged. Footprints in dust, scratches along beams, streaks of powder, faint residue, diagrams tucked behind crates. The story they told was consistent and calm. No danger, no malice, just careful oversight, someone quietly ensuring that the depot's operations moved smoothly, that nothing went awry unnoticed. Mara returned to the rear dock where the van had shifted earlier. The scuff marks on the doors, the tire imprints, the small scratches on the concrete, all now seemed intentional but benign. They were the result of someone moving the van deliberately to check its placement, to ensure accessibility, and to monitor patterns of loading and unloading. She bent to inspect the ground, noticing how the impressions in dust and faint residue mirrored the diagrams she had found. Confirmation of a methodical, careful hand. A quiet understanding settled over her. The mystery had not been one of theft, sabotage, or threat. It had been one of diligence, a slow, patient oversight performed by someone who knew the spaces intimately and had taken care to leave subtle markers that, to a trained eye, recorded every movement. Mara reflected on the rhythm of the building itself, the hum of machinery, the drip of water, the soft creak of beams, all of it interacting with the traces left behind to tell a story of quiet diligence rather than chaos. She moved back toward the loft once more, tracing familiar paths, noting the polished edges and faint warmth in places she had touched before. Each mark, each trace, felt less like a clue to a crime and more like a record of careful attention. The diagrams, the footprints, the scratches, they all connected, forming a consistent narrative of someone quietly monitoring and preserving order. Outside, the fog still pressed gently against the warehouse walls, softening edges, swallowing distant sounds, and settling the light in muted reflections. Mara paused, looking out through the loft window, letting the stillness of the night wash over her. The depot no longer seemed mysterious or threatening. It felt alive with quiet care, marked by attentive hands that had moved through it deliberately and unhurriedly. She took a slow breath, feeling the calm clarity of the discovery settle around her. The patterns were complete, the observations coherent, and the quiet presence that had left traces so subtly now made sense. Mara left the loft and descended the final steps, moving slowly through the annex and back to the main floor. The warehouse felt familiar, serene, and steady, each mark and trace a note in the soft rhythm of daily care. Finally, Mara stepped out into the lot. The van sat where it had been checked, tire imprints pressed into the damp ground, faint scuffs on its doors. The fog drifted around her, soft and hushed, and she understood that the mystery had not been dangerous or malicious at all, but a quiet story of diligence and attentiveness, revealed gradually through careful observation. She stood for a long moment, letting the night and the calm hum of the depot settle fully, a quiet, complete understanding in place, before turning to leave, carrying with her the subtle, unhurried rhythm of the space she had traced and finally understood.